But bureaucracies were bureaucracies, and if bureaucracy was the noun, then ass-kissing was its verb. On the other hand, if he'd signed on to the Merchant Marine, he'd be mopping gravity deck plates for the next 10 years before they'd let him even breathe on any flight controls. But this was freedom. This was life. His own ship, even if he didn't own it, he flew it, and that was just as good. He trailed his hand along the old corridor walls as he bounced his way down to the operations center. Ridley and Taggart would be asleep, or still having sex. It seemed like they never stopped having sex. A week of floating next to a giant rock in the middle of empty space was conducive to breaking down inhibitions, and his two crewmates had succumbed to the flesh spectacularly. Either way, he wasn't about to wake them. This was his mission, his ship. This was freedom. Once across the threshold, he jumped up a few meters and sailed across the operations center, landing cleanly in the navigator's chair, with the ease that came from months at low grav. He entered in the coordinates for their next stop, Sangre de Cristo, the fourth planet in the San Martin system. Just a colony, really. 1 million or so religious fanatics had tired of the oppressive hand of a distant UE and its tin-eared government on San Martin, and had set off on their own. Shovik Orion Industries had been only too happy to provide the domes and contract out the rest of the building effort, and the GPC was far enough in bed with Shovik Orion that he assumed plenty of wallets were embiggening with each shipment to the fledgling colony. His own included, so no complaints. The main drive activated with an ear-deafening roar, one irritating quirk of the ancient freighter, and the inertial cancellers struggled to keep up with the 3G burn. You could Q-jump in and save half a day, of course, but the client had specified no Q-jumping. Harder to track that way. Q-jump signatures could be seen half a system away with the most basic sensor packages. Luckily, Sangre de Cristo wasn't that far from the asteroid belt. They'd be there in 4 hours, and with any luck, Ridley and Taggart would still be asleep, or having their morning coffee, or their morning screw. He dozed off after setting the nav computer to autopilot. The ship would swivel 180 halfway out to Sangre, and automatically start the decel burn. And he'd need to be awake and alert for the actual delivery. Planetary re-entry on an old, rickety freighter like the Magdalena Issachar was like trying to screw a discount-mutated whore on Rigel 3 while half-drunk. It required a certain amount of concentration, but not so much concentration that you realized with horror what the hell you were doing. It had only seemed like his eyes were closed for a few minutes. The alarm was persistent, and it took him several shakes of his head to realize that that particular flavor of alarm was a proximity detector. Shit, something was close. Close enough to trigger a proximity alarm. He scrambled to activate the external video feed and brought up the view on his screen. They were nearly there. Sangre de Cristo glistened far below, its massive oceans reflecting the distant sun's weak blue light. Only internal mantle heating kept the water liquid. He could barely make out the massive, kilometers-long cylindrical domes dotting the rusty-colored eastern island, each transparent, city-wide window keeping the noxious carbon dioxide atmosphere at bay, while letting in enough light to sustain photosynthesis in the genetically modified plants that could survive on such minuscule solar irradiance. But what caught his eye was the ship less than a kilometer away, coming in fast. It was smaller than the Magdalena Issachar, but even at this distance he could see it was armed to the teeth. He didn't recognize any hull markings at this distance. It was obviously human. Dalmasi or Sciorra ships looked unmistakably alien. But their transponder was running silent, a flagrant violation of United Earth law, and Russian Confederation law. Hell, every human government required active transponders, even the GPC. Some in the UE might consider the Galactic People's Congress a terrorist organization, but at least we keep our transponders running. Unidentified ship, this is the Magdalena Issachar out of Britannia on a delivery mission to Sangre. Morning, fellas. Please respond, over. He tried to keep his voice level and conversational. He felt anything but. Other ships never flew right up to you, close enough to wave through the window, Not unless you were intentionally docking with each other or, Danny feared, being forcefully boarded. Unidentified ship, please respond. Nothing. Whatever they were playing at, the other ship was getting uncomfortably close. He toyed with the idea of making a break for it. Would they fire on him? The closer they got, the tighter the knot in Danny's stomach pulled. He flipped on the navigational controls and started adjusting the Magdalena's course. The other ship matched his movement, and moments later another alarm started flashing on his board. They were targeting weapons. Come on, fellas, let's not get carried away here. The message was clear. Don't move, or you're dead. From the sleek lines of the other ship, the heavy armaments and general lack of scuffing and micrometeor impacts, it was clear this was no pirate ship trying to relieve him of his cargo. Someone knew about that crate down in the cargo hold, and whatever was in it was worth shooting at his ship. It was worth his life. A docking tube began to extend out from the other ship's port, and on instinct Danny leapt out of his chair, soared across the operations center, and landed in the corridor at a bounding run. Running at 1/10 G meant a series of powerful one-legged jumps, and by the time he reached the cargo bay, he'd only touched the floor 5 times. Inside the bay, he ducked into the auxiliary airlock just as he heard the ominous metallic sounds of the 2 ships mating together at the main docking port. At a touch to the wall panel, he closed the door most of the way shut, leaving just enough of a slit for him to see out into the space beyond, and part of the walkway that circled the upper part of the cargo bay. And just in time, the docking port opened with a groan, indicating something on the other side was forcing it. Through the slit, he could see several figures in vacuum battle armor launch through the hatch, brandishing guns. Big guns. One motioned to another and pointed towards the giant crate in the center of the cargo bay. The indicated soldier let his gun hang at his shoulder while he pulled out a hand terminal and started working the controls as the other 2 guards stood around him. Hey, Danny, what the hell is going on? I thought I heard... Through the slit, he watched as Matt Ridley, who'd apparently just woken up, padded barefoot onto the catwalk surrounding the bay, still rubbing his eyes. He wore only underwear, which didn't do much to conceal his raging morning wood. His mohawk had lost some of its usual stiffness and seemed to flop like a rooster's comb. A loud crack echoed through the bay, and Danny had to bite down on his fist when he realized what had just happened. A hole blossomed in the middle of Ridley's forehead, and a fine pink mist had sprayed out behind him. He still looked confused as hell as he collapsed. The 1/10 G seemed to take forever to pull the dead young man to the deck. Danny's stomach rose up into his mouth, and he fought the watery feelings of nausea beginning to overtake him. He had to get out. He had to get out. The locker nearby held a vacuum suit. All he had to do was put it on without drawing the attention of the soldiers, open the auxiliary airlock, and jump out. Easy. He could do this. He had to get out. And then what? Didn't matter. All that mattered now was getting away from those guns. He had to get out. The image of the pink mist spraying back from Ridley's head, of him jerking back as the bullet pierced his brain, forced itself back into his thoughts. And to avoid retching, he set himself to work. He pushed the door closed all the way, locked it, and frantically started pulling on the suit, finally clamping the helmet on less than a minute later. Luckily, the data connection to the ship was working, so he brought up the heads-up display and navigated over to the video feed from the cargo bay. 2 of the soldiers were pulling the front panel off the crate, and then one of them retrieved something from a bag hanging from his shoulder, some sort of electronic device. He attached it to the contents of the crate with a magnetic lock. Holy shit. The contents of the crate. There was only one thing in there, resting on the center of a pallet. It looked remarkably like an atmospheric re-entry nuclear missile, square tail fin and all. A gentle sway in the ship's gravity field told him that the engines had cut out, and the inertial cancellers compensated for the change in the acceleration vector. They'd arrived at Sangre, and just in time. He worked the airlock controls with one hand while trying to get the comm open to Taggart. Silence. Either still asleep or... He shook the thought and initiated the airlock sequence. The air cycled out of the chamber and the outer hatch opened, and not looking back, he pulled himself out. Sangre de Cristo's oceans glistened below, and he could just make out one of the vast cylindrical domes on one of the peninsulas. He clung tightly to the handholds lining the hull and started climbing around the Magdalena, away from the view of the other ship. A whisper crackled in his ear. "Matt, where are you? Matt? Danny, I hear people out there. Matt? He was about to key in a response when the sound of a door opening came through the comm, followed by a sudden sharp intake of breath by Taggart, and a whispered, "Oh God," and a second later a loud crack, identical to the one that had emptied Matt's head. Danny tried to cover his mouth, pawing at his face shield, putting up a valiant effort to stem the flow of vomit. The rancid smell pierced his nose, and he swore as he realized the contents of his stomach now covered the face shield of the helmet, obscuring his view. Below him, he felt the maneuvering thrusters of the ship burn. He hadn't programmed that. The intruders were moving the ship. The Magdalena Issachar slowly turned to point straight down to the planet below. He looked back. The other ship had retracted its docking tube and fired its own engines. The Magdalena started accelerating. The pull of his own inertia nearly broke his grip on the handhold. With a dull ache in his roiling stomach, he realized he had a choice to make. The soldiers, whoever they were, had clearly set the ship on a course that would take it down into the atmosphere and crash on Sangre de Cristo. Bail now, or try to re-enter the ship and override whatever course the soldiers had set. And that missile. There was no question what they were trying to do. He made his choice, pulling himself back toward the auxiliary airlock. There was still time. He touched the exterior control panel. Not operational. He yanked on the manual override, which didn't budge. He'd been locked out. Whatever tech the soldiers had, they'd been able to override the manual override's controls, which he thought was technically impossible. That left the only alternative. He crouched down on the side of the ship, perpendicular to the horizon, and with a grunt, he jumped as hard as he could. The ship fell away from him, and now that he was free of its acceleration, the Magdalena Issachar shot forward, speeding towards its doom. He wondered if he'd jumped clear in time to make orbit, or if he'd similarly fall to his death. Would the atmosphere burn him up first, or would he get to at least enjoy a few minutes of freefall? Why was he thinking of enjoying a freefall? He'd just watched one friend get his brains blown out, and heard it happen to the other friend. He was fucked. Danny, language! His aunt's sharp voice cut into his thoughts. If he wasn't about to die, he'd have laughed at the absurdity of hearing her scolding in his head, even as he drifted through space in freefall. Time seemed to elongate, stretch out past all recognition of seconds or minutes, and he could have sworn that at one point he fell asleep, though he granted that he may have been hallucinating. Either way, the small engine exhaust plume that was the Magdalena burned faster and faster towards the surface, until it was just a tiny dot set against one of the habitation domes. "Bye, Mags," he whispered. And then the nuclear missile detonated. Danny's eyes automatically closed, his hands covered his helmet, and even through the hands, his eyelids, the face shield, and the vomit, the intense glare of the piercing radioactive light made him cry out. A minute later, a mushroom cloud. And a minute after that, he started to feel the faint roar in his suit that announced he, too, was entering the outer fringe of the atmosphere. And strangely enough, rather than focus on his own impending death, all he could think about was the cargo, the mysterious customer, and the equally mysterious boarding party that had killed his friends and killed his ship, killed his future. As the roar intensified and his arms and legs began to feel the drag of the rarefied air, another thought struck him as he watched the mushroom cloud billow up to the upper atmosphere. Whoever they were trying to start a war. Chapter 1. Oxford Novum University, Whitehaven, Britannia. Curie Building, Lecture Hall 201. Professor Shelby Proctor paused her lecture mid-sentence to glare at the monitor on her lectern. A text box had popped up, flashing red. Priority 1. Integrated Defense Fleet, CENTCOM. Priority 1? Bullshit. IDF could wait. I retired 10 years ago. I'm not their lapdog anymore. She clicked the message off with a wave of her hand and turned back to the chalkboard in front of the packed auditorium. She was the only professor that she knew of at Oxford Novum University that used a chalkboard. The only professor on Britannia, for that matter, but she was 68 years old, a decorated former fleet admiral, a friggin' war hero, and most importantly an expert in xenobiology. Could use whatever the hell she wanted. So, you can see that the mere presence of the mitochondrial DNA structure within the Scura cell walls suggests not only a similar evolutionary pattern to species native to Earth, but also implies that primordial prokaryotic cell union into eukaryotic structures is not only one possible basis for advanced life, but perhaps the only basis, especially given that similar structures are seen in Dulmasi cells and every other fossilized remains of now-dead civilizations that we've happened upon in the power vacuum left behind by the swarm. Is it true that you fought the last swarm carrier 12 years ago, Professor Proctor? Destroyed it? The only living swarm matter left in the galaxy? An interruption. Damn kids. She turned around from the chalkboard to face the rows and rows of university students. They were getting younger by the year, it seemed. And if she wasn't mistaken, stupider. Or was that just the cranky old fleet admiral talking? Stupider. She could almost hear her proper English major mother berate her. That is not only incredibly off-topic, young man, but also highly classified. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you where you sit. Her eyes drilled into him like antimatter beams, and she could tell the student wasn't sure if she was joking or not. And don't assume that I'm kidding. The kid blushed. Good. Proctor struggled to keep a smirk off her own face. Oh. I mean, everyone talks about it, so I assumed... I thought that since you were there, fighting the swarm over Earth and Britannia and stuff, I thought you could tell us a little? He trailed off as her eyes drilled into him again, and he started squirming. You know what happens when you assume? You make an ass out of you, and... Only you, I'm a horrible speller. Some of the class laughed. For the rest of them, she added, Normally, assuming makes an ass out of you and me. But today, the moniker belongs exclusively to the young man in the back row. The rest of the class laughed. He flustered even more. But, I was just thinking that the genocide of the swarm might, be helpful to talk about, and just because you're able to open your mouth and dribble verbal diarrhea, forming barely intelligible phrases which I assume are English, spilling sensitive, classified information out for all our enemies to hear and take advantage of does not make it unclassified. This may not be a military college, young man. That does not mean that we won't strictly observe security protocols while I am your teacher. The kid was clearly embarrassed. His face turned red and he started playing with the dozens of piercings hanging off his ear. It was just like all the other kids in this generation, oblivious to the sacrifices made by the ones before him. Her sacrifices. Blithely throwing around words like genocide that he hardly understood the meaning of. Proctor grimaced as she saw him begin to open his mouth again. Damn, Prof! It was just a question. No need to get snippy or... Snippy? Proctor dropped the chalk, and it clattered into several pieces when it broke on the floor. Listen, young man. I realize your hearing must be completely shot, what with all the nano-dildos sticking through your earlobes, so I'll repeat it once more for you. We don't talk military shit in this classroom. We talk science. Got it? The auditorium was as quiet as space itself. The student started packing up his things. Professor, this is a microaggression. Your words are incredibly hurtful, and I'm going to file a report with the Committee for Respect and Inclusion and get you reprimanded for speaking hurtfully to a student who only asked— Oh, please, she began, picking up the pieces of chalk. We both know what you were implying. That I'm some kind of genocidal maniac for finally destroying the last remnant of the race that terrorized our civilization for decades. Let me tell you, young man, you have no idea what it was like out there. No idea. None of them. How could they? How could anyone? But now that the stopper was released, there was no holding back. No idea! Never knowing when death would find you. Wondering if your next engagement with the swarm would be your last. So unless you want to see what a macroaggression looks like, I suggest you hightail it out of my classroom and get your ass into Dick Knitting 101. The look on the kid's face was priceless, and well worth the official reprimands she knew would trickle down from the administration. Same as the last time she'd lost her cool and went to town on the previous unsuspecting, clueless student. So far, there hadn't been any investigations or committee hearings, just the university president taking her aside at the last senatorial reception and giving her a stern but deferential talking to. She was the former fleet admiral of IDF, after all. She fought alongside the frickin' hero of Earth himself, Captain Timothy Granger. He got up and left in a huff, and the faces of the remaining students seemed to be evenly split between looks of worshipful adoration and distasteful sanctimony. But she was too old to care what people thought about her. All that mattered now was the science, the teaching, and kicking back with a glass of the finest Cabernet at night. Now, where were we? Yes, mitochondrial DNA. One interesting facet of the most recent knowledge exchange with the Sciora generational ship Magnanimity is that their cell structure is— The door to her right creaked open, revealing two burly military MPs in IDF fatigues, escorting some top IDF brass, followed by a face out of her past. He strode in purposefully, as if he owned the place. The overhead lights gleamed off the white Fleet Admiral bars on his shoulders. The old man nodded once, and glancing at the rows of students, said, Admiral Proctor, I'm sorry to intrude, but I'm afraid it's urgent. The jackass. She could see his subtle grin at the students as rustling whispers spread through the auditorium like wildfire. Everyone recognized the head of IDF, Integrated Defense Force, United Earth's interstellar military organization. He always loved performing in front of a captive audience, occupying the center of attention and being fawned over by adoring civilians. Class dismissed, said Proctor, waving them all off. When the last student had gathered her things and closed the door, Proctor turned back to the man. Fleet Admiral Oppenheimer, to what do I owe the pleasure? Shelby, he began. It's good to see you. An extended hand. She ignored it. I wish I could say the same, Christian. She wanted to say worse, but even so his face cringed slightly. He had replaced her as Fleet Admiral of IDF 10 years ago, and the parting had not been amicable. They hadn't clashed when they first met, years ago, during the emergency of the Second Swarm War. The derelict Constitution had been sacrificed to hold off the swarm during one of the last violent skirmishes, and the Warrior was destroyed by overwhelming swarm antimatter beams. Granger and Proctor had mustered their surviving crew aboard the Victory, where Oppenheimer was serving as XO. He'd been level-headed and down-to-earth then, not the political showman he was today. There were three things that could fundamentally change a person: time, alcohol, and managing a bureaucracy. And Oppenheimer suffered from at least two of the three. We have a situation, he said, withdrawing his hand and beginning to pace across the front of the auditorium. The two MPs accompanying him stepped out the door, as if by previous arrangement with him. Something is happening in the Aragoyan sector, and in the Dalmassi sectors near it. The Dalmassi would never admit it to us, but our intel is unmistakable. Something has them reeling. Her heart skipped a beat. Swarm? No. She relaxed a hair, though she considered what her reaction meant. She was responsible for their complete and utter annihilation years ago, and even though she'd taken umbrage at the sniping from the microaggressed student suggesting that she was responsible for genocide, well, it was half true. She felt it, the guilt. Was she a monster? No, she was following orders, saving Earth, saving civilization. And she slept well at night. But half true all the same. Oppenheimer continued. Not that we can tell, anyway, which is very little. But the attack signatures are definitely not swarm, it's something else. He stopped pacing and faced her. Something new. Something big. She shrugged. Not my problem anymore, Christian. Give an old woman her retirement. Why don't you send the Chesapeake out there? Captain Diaz is more than capable. He served with me on the Constitution, the Warrior, the Victory, and even the Chesapeake itself. It's the friggin' flagship. And if anyone can handle the situation, it's him. Oppenheimer nodded, stroking his chin. We did, last night. A pause. He leaned against the chalkboard and seemed almost reluctant to continue. Damn it. She knew what he was about to say before he even started. We just received word this morning that Captain Diaz is dead. The Chesapeake is destroyed. Chapter 2. Oxford Novum University, Whitehaven, Britannia. Curie Building, Lecture Hall 201. Destroyed? How? Proctor groped for her chair and collapsed into it. Diaz was an old friend. Served as her XO for years aboard the Chesapeake before she'd left Starship Command to become the Fleet Admiral and lead all of IDF. Worst decision of her life. We lost metaspace contact with the Chesapeake early this morning, after they reported engaging a ship of unknown design and origin out in the Irigoyen sector. A scout ship was sent to pick up their trail, and all it found was debris and signs of an intense battle. No sign of the unknown ship. Proctor couldn't believe it. Captain Diaz was the best officer in the fleet as far as she was concerned, and the Chesapeake was IDF's flagship. There were other ships that were more powerful, others that were larger, and every single ship in the fleet was more modern by far. But Chesapeake was the last of the legacy fleet, the handful of ships whose thick tungsten armor and ability to sustain massive amounts of damage helped save Earth not once, but twice from swarm incursions. And now it was gone. The last of the legacy fleet, gone forever. An era had officially passed. Did they send back any visuals? Negative. There was just no time between when they engaged it and when they were destroyed. We literally know nothing about this threat, other than the fact that it handily destroyed our flagship in less than 5 minutes. What about the terrorist action on Sangre de Cristo? Is this related? Same sector? Oppenheimer shook his head. Not that we can tell. We still have no idea who did it. The GPC claims it was us. Our intel points to a radical faction of the Russian Confederation. The RC claims it was Grangerite fanatics. The Grangerite Patriarch announced on the news this morning that he suspects the CIDR, which the Chinese, of course, vehemently deny. CIDR thinks it's us, too. Just a massive fucking headache. Watch your language, she replied automatically. But she was lost in thought, trying to make connections between the two incidents. The Admiral ignored her. Whoever dropped that bomb will pay. Ever since last week, we've been escorting the relief ships and the humanitarian convoys heading out to Sangre. Completely destroyed one of the habitation domes, about 50,000 dead. And the rest of the domes are in a state of pandemonium. They all think they're next. Riots, food shortages, the works. And with all the political bullshit going on, everyone pointing fingers at each other, half of them aimed at us, we get this. An unknown ship, completely foreign design, not human, not Domasi, not Sciora, and not responding to any of our hails. And now the Chesapeake. He trailed off. Professor Proctor stood up and grabbed hold of the lectern, using it to steady herself. The news came as a shock, and she suspected why Admiral Oppenheimer had come. Given her lifelong experience with not only the Swarm, but all things alien, be it Domasi, Sciora, Quiasi, Findiri, or the handful of long-dead civilizations destroyed by the Swarm in their 10,000-year scourge across the galaxy, he was most likely going to ask for help understanding the new threat. To study up, and as the old adage said, science the shit out of it. Fine. Send me everything you've got. I'll make my recommendations to the Joint Chiefs once I've had a chance to go over the material. And I'll even set up a rapid response science team if you manage to bring back any samples or recordings of the new threat. I imagine that, Shelby, I'm not here asking for your help in a lab. We don't have time for science. She turned to face him. Then what the hell are you here for, Christian? I'm here because I need you back. I need you to take a ship and go figure this out before it destroys us all. She laughed out loud. Christian, you can't be serious. I'm almost 70 years old. I teach Xenobiology 101 and I just bought a condo down on the beach. Only 20 kilometers away. Do you know how long I waited for one of those properties to free up? Do you realize what the real estate market is like on Britannia? Beach properties have a 10-year waiting list at least. It's insane, Christian. They tried to charge me over Shelby. He wasn't buying her change of subject. We need you. I need me. My baby brother and his wife and kids need me. My students need me. United Earth needs you. No. She was done. She'd played the puppet. She'd acted the part. She'd let her military career be run and manipulated by aspiring and conspiratorial admirals, generals, and worse, unscrupulous and greedy politicians, always responding to the next politically manufactured crisis, rather than addressing the real threat. That real threat. The galaxy was an unthinkably large place, and humanity surely hadn't discovered all its perils. There were other swarms, other civilizational threats, and what had United Earth's administration and the Joint Chiefs had her do during her tenure as captain, and later as fleet admiral? Maneuvering the fleets for maximum political posturing, against the Russian Confederation, against the Caliphate, against the Chinese Intersolar Democratic Republic, against whatever internal enemy du jour the United Earth politicians wanted to impress or intimidate with a few starships. United Earth? The administration can go to hell. Admiral Oppenheimer grunted and bent over to pick up a stray piece of chalk that had escaped her notice. The government? I'm not talking about the government, Shelby. President Quimby can go finger his own asshole for all I care. I'm talking about our civilization. The hundreds of billions of children, women, and men that call our world home. That United Earth needs you. She sat down, flicking off her lesson plan, and stared at the blank monitor screen. She'd heard it all before. It was the same speech every administration figure and every senator had thrown at her when she was fleet admiral. And the answer was still the same. No, she said, and stood back up, picked up her briefcase. She hated calling it a purse, and opened the door. Find another hero, Christian. This one's ship has sailed. There's one more thing, Shelby. She paused at the threshold. Yes? I understand your nephew, your brother's son, is living on San Martin. Yes, she repeated. San Martin is in the Irigoyen sector, Shelby. And Sangre de Cristo is in the San Martin system. And just 2 hours ago I received reports. Her stomach clenched. Danny was her brother's oldest, and had just started college on San Martin the year before. What kind of reports? IDF Intel has been trying to put the pieces together on this terrorist incident. 50,000 people incinerated, and he calls it an incident. He continued. I can't go into all the details because your security clearance has lapsed, but There's been social unrest recently on San Martin. Stuff that hasn't made it onto the news. GPC related.
Yeah, I knew that. Everyone knows that.
He shrugged. But what you might not know is that IDF Intel has been tracking Danny for about a year now.
Tracking Danny? Why?
And 3 weeks ago, he disappeared. Gone. And we have reason to suspect he might be involved in the Sangre incident.
She turned and shut the door again. Impossible. Danny's a good kid. He'd never, ever get involved in anything like this. Period.
Oppenheimer shrugged. I'm only passing along what I've heard. Just consider it. The Chesapeake is destroyed by an unknown enemy, Captain Diaz is dead, and just 20 light years away in the same sector, a colony gets hit by a nuclear terrorist attack. And in the same system, you have widespread social and political unrest. The events are not obviously related, but, well, I'll let you connect your own dots. It's your family, after all.
Yes, Danny was family.
And so was Diaz. Before he'd been captain, he was her XO.
Damn it. Oppenheimer knew exactly how to ensnare her. Fine. Just this once, just this mission. After it's done, and we've sorted it out, I'm gone for good.
Oppenheimer flashed a half-smile. I know you'd come around. Good. He pulled a small datapad out of his pocket and tapped on it. Moments later, the door opened, and the officers who'd accompanied him reappeared. We've got you a ship, and the crew is mostly in place. I give you the luxury of choosing your own senior staff, your pick of anyone in IDF, of course.
What old clunker of a ship did you requisition away from some hapless captain somewhere?
Oppenheimer's half-smile bloomed into a full grin. Old? Hardly. This time, Shelby, I think even you'll be impressed. If you follow Commander Yarbrough here, he'll familiarize you with the Independence. The ship name stirred a vague memory of some classified conversations long ago.
Why does that sound familiar?
Because IDF Engineering conceived the project under your tenure. It was, and is, highly classified.
Why?
Oppenheimer walked out the door, calling behind as he left. You're about to find out. Chapter 3. Oxford Novum University, Whitehaven, Britannia. Curie Building, Lecture Hall 201.
If you'll follow me, ma'am,
said Commander Yarbrough, holding an arm out towards the door. Proctor eyed him with unease before picking her briefcase back up and retreating out of the classroom. Yarbrough followed close behind. He was young, and already struck her as hopelessly overeager.
I think you'll be very pleased with what we've been doing in ship design the past few years, ma'am,
he said with a bounce in his step that she found almost nauseating.
I'm sure.
She followed him to the shuttle parked on the landing pad and slid into the co-pilot seat next to him.
We headed to Scotland Yard?
She asked, referring tongue-in-cheek to the dry dock shipyards on the outskirts of town. The citizens of Whitehaven, Britannia's capital city, were known for their quirky sense of humor.
No, ma'am. This ship has far too high a classification for that. We couldn't have everyone in Whitehaven look out the window and see our little bird hovering in the distance.
Little bird?
That's our nickname for the ISS Independence. The lead designer thought it fitting. You'll meet her soon. She'll be the chief engineer on the mission. I thought I got to choose my senior staff, said Proctor. Are we already pulling the bait and switch? Shit.
Commander Yarbrough shook his head as he maneuvered the shuttle out to IDF's Whitehaven base near Scotland Yard shipyards on the outskirts of the city.
No, ma'am. You're, of course, free to replace her at your whim, though I would think with her expertise in the design of the ship, you might want to keep her on. The new tech we've built into her is, well, impressive is not a terribly impressive word, but it's all I've got.
They landed, debarked, and climbed aboard an orbital transfer shuttle that would take them up through the atmosphere and out to Wellington shipyards, in orbit around the gas giant Calais, past the asteroid belt, just one Q-jump away. As she passed through the hatch, she nearly jumped when a booming voice greeted her. "Shelby, damn good to see you." Sitting in the pilot's seat was a middle-aged man who seemed like he was stuffed into the uniform of a recently graduated cadet. In spite of the tight-fitting flight suit, his face sported a fashionable, well-groomed goatee, and of course a broad, friendly smile. She smiled back. "Good to see you too, Ballsy," she said, using his own call sign from when they'd served together on the Constitution and the Warrior. Captain Tyler Ballsy Voles, though what he was doing here and not on his own ship escaped her for a split second, before she remembered his ship had been decommissioned the year before. "Did Oppenheimer suck you into this too?" "Suck? Hell, I asked for it. Rumor was going around last night that he was calling you back into service, and I wasn't going to let some snot-nosed kid be your CAG." Proctor gaped at him. He was pushing 60 himself, and should have had a cushy desk job as a rear admiral somewhere with a beach. "You're volunteering to be my commander of the air group? Do European politicians smell like cheap prostitutes?" He turned in his seat to smirk at Commander Yarbrough, whose face had wrinkled up at the improper reference. That's a yes, son, they do." "But you've got the rank of captain, Ballsy." "Which made it a whole lot easier to pull the strings necessary to get here. Hold on," he added as he pushed the accelerator to maximum. The buildings flew past in a blur. "Captain Vols, please keep the flight parameters within normal range," said Commander Yarbrough, gripping his armrests. "Kindly unclench your sphincter, Commander. I've been flying one of these things since before you were born." He angled the nose skyward, and the shuttle leapt through the clouds. Proctor smiled. Tyler Vols was one of the senior staff she would have chosen anyway, if she'd known he'd say yes. As deeply uneasy as she felt about this mission, having him along took the edge off her apprehension. "So, tell me, Commander Yarbrough, what kind of new tech does this baby have?" she said. Yarbrough nervously tightened his seat restraint as the craft blazed up towards the atmosphere. "Oh, various new offensive and defensive capabilities, as well as a new experimental propulsion system. We call it trans-quantum jump technology. Basically lets us do an unusually long standard Q jump, about 50 times as far." Proctor puffed out a surprised breath. 5 light years per jump? Holy shit. Yarbrough nodded solemnly. "Indeed. I've been doing preliminary tests with the skeleton crew we have aboard. Our navigator calls them tranny jumps, though I've asked her repeatedly to stop," he added with a pained expression. Apparently the schoolyard humor was wasted on him, though. Proctor smiled on the inside at the term. Tranny jump. Best not to say that one in front of Oppenheimer. "Tranny jumps?" Ballsy smirked. "I'll have to remember that one." Yarbrough fiddled with the co-pilot controls in an attempt to compensate for Captain Vols's gut-churning maneuvers through the atmosphere. The old fighter pilot simply couldn't help himself as he spiraled them up to space. "I've devoted quite a bit of thought to this, actually. At first I thought we could stick with Q jumps for continuity's sake, but then I leaned toward T jumps for disambiguation. But once I realized that T jumps could be confused with transmission dumps from the comm station, T dumps, I came up with QT jumps." "Cutie jumps?" Vols made a face. Yarbrough shrugged. "But then I decided a more formal approach might be needed, so I came up with a list of possibilities that might—" Proctor rolled her eyes. This commander certainly dotted his I's. "We'll just stick with T jumps, Commander." She watched out the viewport in front of them as the atmosphere blazed past. Yarbrough had engaged the inertial cancellers. She was pleasantly surprised. Inertial canceller technology must have also improved since she resigned from IDF, as the turbulence during their ascent was hardly noticeable. "How big is this beauty, anyway?" Ballsy smirked again. "That's what she said." "You never grew up, did you?" Proctor feigned a frown, but truth be told she missed the banter, the crude jokes, and the joy of serving with fellow irreverent officers in spite of having her strings constantly pulled, yanked, usually, by top brass and politicians. Academia never filled that void for her. How could it? "Now why the hell would I want to do that?" Commander Yarbrough pulled out a small datapad, unfolded it, and started reading. 501 meters long,
powered by a 50 terawatt direct injection dual fusion antimatter plant. Central computer is infinitely cored and non-localized, distributed throughout the walls and decks of the ship. Standard propulsion is rated at over 10 Gs, with quad-stabilized and phase-shifted graviton-emitting inertial cancellers. The tranny drive's cap banks recharge in under a minute, enabling the maximum long-range cruising rate of over 300 light-years an hour and over 50... Proctor held up a hand. 300 light-years per hour? That gets us to the edge of known space in less than 2 hours. Yes, ma'am. Like I said, it's highly classified. IDF has been sitting on this tech for 3 years now and is eager that it not become common knowledge quite yet.
Proctor did the math and figured they could get the Independence to the Irigoyen sector in less than 10 minutes. Hell, this thing is on as soon as I gather my crew.
As if on cue, Vols announced, "Hold tight, boys and girls, we're about to make the Q jump to Calais." A few seconds later, he pressed the initiator button, and the view out the windows suddenly changed, from the blue-tinged atmosphere of Britannia to the red and orange-dappled clouds of Calais, one of the Britannia system's 2 gas giants. A few dozen kilometers away floated Wellington shipyards, where dozens of ships in various stages of assembly or maintenance were connected to giant, sweeping construction nacelles. It had been mostly destroyed during the Second Swarm War, but in a fit of post-war construction, IDF had rebuilt her, even larger than the first, keeping with humanity's defiantly stubborn tradition of, "You knocked down my toy, I built an even bigger toy." Tucked underneath one of the nacelles, like a little bird nestled under its mother's wing, was a ship unlike any Proctor had seen. While the old legacy fleet ships she'd served on during the last half of her military career were old, bulky, and built for punishing combat, this one seemed like a work of art. "There she is, Admiral," said Yarbrough. "Ready to leave space dock at your command."
Vols whistled.
"She's a beauty, all right. Nothing like the clunkers we're used to. Then again, those old clunkers saved our lives more times than I can count. You sure this thing is up to it? Any tricks up her sleeve?"
And after over an hour of constant frowns, furrowed brows, and worried consternation, Yarbrough finally smiled.
"You'll see."
Chapter 4. Irigoyen Sector. Bolivar System, Bolivar. Watchdog Station, high orbit. Lieutenant Ethan Civic knew, beyond a doubt, that his posting aboard the defensive platform Watchdog over the far-flung colony world of Bolivar was a punishment. Retaliation for insubordination. Well, insubordination in the eyes of his former dickweed of a commander. In essence, all he'd done was tell the truth. "That uniform does make you look fat, ma'am." That was all he'd said. Was there anything wrong with that? She'd asked him for his unvarnished, truthful opinion, and he'd given it. Sure, it could have been the time he'd shown up drunk for duty, but it seemed like half the officers on the Farragut did that anyway. The XO was a fat bastard fluff coke addict herself, so she tended to look the other way with the sorts of violations that would make her a hypocrite if she called her crew on them. But insulting her appearance, even when she looked like a massive, overgrown, stoned toad? Heresy. He pressed a few buttons, on mental autopilot, running through the regular hourly sensor scans that would ostensibly warn him of any unexpected ships in the vicinity of Bolivar. Due to the recent emergency on Sangre de Cristo, and the even more recent disappearance of the Chesapeake about 10 light-years away, he even paid some attention to the scans. Usually he played solitaire or Jack's doozies while the scans came in, confirming the negative reading by the soft beep that always accompanied the lack of any intruders. Intruders? Huh. It had been years, decades, since there had been any intruders. The swarm was dead. The Russian Confederation had withdrawn into a state of inward-looking hermitage. The Caliphate had elected a mullah that, for once, was preaching not only peaceful coexistence, but cooperation with United Earth. And the Chinese Intersolar Democratic Republic, as usual, only wanted to profit from the West. But profit peacefully. War was bad for business. unless that business was armament and ships, in which case the CIDR profited almost as handsomely as when there was peace. He looked out the window and fell out of his chair. He never usually fell out of his chair, at least not while sober, but even so he found himself on the floor. He'd tried to leap to his feet so fast that his knees had collided with the cramped console in front of him and sent him sprawling down again, painfully. "Emergency action," he called upward towards the autocom. "Defensive ops on full alert, intruder approaching." Why hadn't he heard anything? If the scan came back clean, there would have been the usual beep. If the scan came back with a contact, there would have been a raucous klaxon, just like in drills. He'd have to have a stern talking to with the boys down in maintenance. To his eyes, the ship was nothing much to look at. Bulky, but with no discernible surface features indicating weaponry, covered with small, pod-like protrusions. But an intruder was an intruder. He'd received no notice from IDF to expect any unknown ships or foreign vessels, so that made this a red alert event. Except all he wanted to do was drink. A lot. He reached down to his knee, fumbling with the top of his boot, loosening the strap and reaching inside for the small flask just below his knee. He usually never started drinking until just before getting off duty, but today was special. Why it was special he couldn't fathom. It just felt special, damn it. And everyone knows you drink on special days. The little ship erupted with a red beam which pierced the defensive platform. Well, that's a problem, he thought, and seriously considered getting on the comm to alert the magrail crews. Instead, he tipped the flask back and downed the whole thing. Damn, I need more of this shit. The door to his little command center burst open and Commander Dipshit strode through. At least that was what Civic called him in his mind. His mustache bounced up and down when he walked, and his comb-over tended to stick upright when he was agitated. And now was one of those comb-over erection moments. He supposed the ship firing at them was the cause, but was it really something to let one's comb-over stick up like that? Honestly, he looked like he should be driving an old-style darkened-window hover van past a school, slowly, waving candy out the window. What the hell is going on, Civic? Why weren't we warned? Blow it out your hole. He stifled the rude response, allowing a slightly less rude retort to come out in its place. Seriously, sir, do I have to do everything around here? Part of him couldn't believe his ears. Was he really saying that? What the hell was he doing? The other part of him laughed like a 12-year-old boy and wanted to add a boob joke, just for good measure. Honestly, the commander's man-boobs jiggled with every step. It was hysterically funny, especially when combined with the comb-over erection and the flop sweat. The commander stopped in his tracks. He looked conflicted, alternating between a face that wanted to clock his subordinate and a face that was absolutely, utterly bewildered. Thankfully, the bewilderment won out. Something's off, Civic. Can you feel it? Feel it? Are you asking me to fondle your balls again? Because that look on your face tells me shut the hell up, Lieutenant, and listen. Civic forced himself to bottle up the next adolescent comment and calm his breathing to the point that he could hear. Shouting, screaming, laughing. Somewhere down the hall, someone was having an amazing party. Or a bloody-fisted death match. Whatever it was loud. The commander swore. Can't you feel that? The man's hands shook and his eyes grew wide. He flexed his fingers into white-knuckled fists. Under his breath, barely audible to Civic, he muttered a foreign-sounding word and crossed himself. Gogothica. Huh? And what the hell was the guy doing crossing himself? Had he always been religious? The laughs and screams down the hall sounded out even louder. And why they're partying while we're being fired at is beyond me, Pat. Patsy. Can I call you Patsy? A fist sucker-punched Civic across the face, and his mouth filled with blood. Shit. Am I going to take this? Time to muster up, Ethan. As soon as I find that next drink. Commander Flopsweat, rather than swing a second punch, leaned over the console, pressing the all-station comm button. All hands, this is Commander Smith. Fight it, people. You know what I mean. You feel it. The voice is telling you to...
do things that you know you shouldn't. Fight it. That's an order. Do your duty. Or I'll come and beat the shit out of each of you. Smith out.
The voices. What the hell was the man talking about? Damn it, things always made more sense when he'd gotten a few bottles down. And where did I put that second one? He fumbled at his other boot, but another voice in his head, a more reasonable-sounding, boring voice, said there was truth in his commanding officer's warning. He was not feeling normal. In fact, he was pulled in two directions. Half of him wanted to spring into action, be the hero, pulverize the alien ship, save the day. The other half wanted to knee his commander in the balls, take another swig from his flask, and go join the party down the hall.
Lieutenant Civic, if you don't start issuing orders to return fire, I'll send you to the brig, said Commander Comb-Over Erection. His jaw trembled, as if he were only just barely containing his rage. Civic toyed with the idea of cajoling the man further, payback for the sucker punch. But a moment later he realized how irrational that was. After all, they were being fired upon by an alien ship. Holy shit, an alien ship! Commander Potbelly continued. His trembling subsided. It appeared he'd gotten control of himself. Perfect opportunity to throw another ball joke his way. And issue a distress call. Tell IDF CENTCOM we're under attack. Out the window, the little ship continued firing, advancing on the watchdog until it was just a few kilometers away. Then, it unleashed hell. And Civic, in spite of the oncoming storm, continued fumbling with the clasp at the top of the other boot. There it is, he thought, finding the second flask. He'd need it to cope with what he could see coming towards the station. Chapter 5. Wellington Shipyards, Calais, Britannia System. Conference Room, ISS Independence. 4 hours after she had boarded the Independence, Admiral Proctor stood at the head of the conference table. For her it was 1 o'clock in the morning, but on ship's time it was only the second hour of the second shift, so she'd need to stay up for several more hours at least, and she felt it. She hadn't had to pull an all-nighter since she was a captain. Damn, I'm getting old. Thank you all for coming. For some of you, this was a long trip. Believe me, I was hoping to enjoy my retirement and my classroom in peace, until I became so old and accumulated so many cats that they'd have me committed. Uneasy chuckling around the table. They all knew why they were here, and most of them, having fought through the Second Swarm War 30 years ago, knew all too well what could be coming. First, some brief introductions. She held up a hand to the gray-haired man next to her. Captain Prucha will be my XO for this mission. Admiral, began Commander Yarbrough. Far be it from me to take issue with your personnel assignments, but wouldn't it be more prudent to have someone who was intimately familiar with this new ship and the crew as our XO? Proctor looked daggers at him. Yes, Commander, you're right about one thing. Far be it from you to take issue with my personnel assignments. Some of her old hands around the table chuckled. The chief engineer clucked her tongue several times. Yarbrough, however, continued undeterred. At least he was persistent, she could give him that. But, Admiral, IDF regulations clearly state that the choice of XO is to be guided primarily by... She turned to him, letting a sharp note tinge her voice. The regulations clearly state, Commander, that the prerogative lies with the commanding officer as to who she wants in which position. End of story. Yarbrough's mouth abruptly shut, and he shrugged his reluctant agreement. However, she continued, I want you as the Assistant XO since, as you rightly point out, you've been with the crew since they were assigned and know the ship inside and out. That seemed to placate him. Good. The last thing I need is an uppity commander questioning my every move. Captain Prucha has graciously agreed to return early from his sabbatical. I believe you have a ship of your own waiting for you, don't you, Jeremy? He flashed one of his easy smiles she always remembered him for. The Forester, yes. New heavy cruiser they just finished out at Omaha Shipyards on Earth. But how could I turn down one last mission with the legend herself?
She smirked uneasily.
Flattery will get you everywhere, Captain. Or it may just get you airlocked, depends on my mood.
She turned to the other end of the table.
I believe you all know the chief engineer, who apparently designed the ship from scratch.
She indicated the mousy, purple-haired woman seated at the other end, who flapped a wrinkled hand up in greeting to everyone.
Commander Reyna Scott. Reyna, how the hell is it that you're not a captain yet? You're as old as I am. 'Cause I don't wanna, came the gruff reply.
Proctor shrugged.
Fair enough.
The chief engineer glanced at the rest of the senior staff.
And call me Commander Reyna, or Granny Reyna, or just Reyna, unless you don't mind an occasional blunt hydro wrench to your face.
Commander Yarbrough raised a tentative hand.
But regulation clearly states that you can shove your regulations up your skinny ass, Yarbrough.
Reyna cackled.
I've been around the bend enough times to be called whatever the hell I want. So unless you want me calling you Commander Rectum for the rest of the mission, I suggest you stop quoting regulations at me.
Commander Vols, who'd been sitting silently next to Commander Scott the entire time, put an arm around her. I think I like her, Admiral. Can I keep her? Everyone chuckled. Vols and Reyna had been close since their days on the Chesapeake over 20 years prior.
You all know Captain Vols, or Ballsy as his friends call him. He'll be CAG, though I'm hoping this mission will not involve any fighter battles.
Vols shrugged and his goatee wrinkled. No fighter battles. We gotta have some fun, Admiral. All work and no play makes Ballsy a dull boy. Captain Prucha struck his thumb over at Vols.
Something tells me that Ballsy will find a way to make this interesting, whether we want him to or not. Let's not forget the little incident during the Battle of Mao Prime.
Hey, I swear, those holes in the ISS Lincoln were already there, Reyna snickered.
Oh, are we calling that an incident now? That's not what they called it at your court-martial. I believe old General Norton, God rest his cantankerous soul, called it ass-hattery of the highest caliber. People, please,
said Admiral Proctor, holding up her hands. The underlying tension they all felt from the emergency returned.
As much as I'd enjoy catching up on old times, we've got a serious situation here.
She finished out the introductions. Lieutenant Jerusha Whitehorse as the tactical crew chief, Ensign Annie Risa as helm crew leader, polyglot Lieutenant Quirty at the comm, he tipped an imaginary hat, and Science Chief Commander Mumford, who would have looked like a heavyweight boxer were it not for the old-fashioned, black plastic-rimmed glasses on his nose. Ballsy interrupted her. Didn't you used to be a boxer, Commander Mumford? I did. Proctor raised her eyebrows. She hadn't expected her guess to have been right.
Really? What brought you to the dark side? Science doesn't pay nearly as well as professional sports.
I like beating the shit out of things, he said, nodding as if that explained everything. He pushed his glasses back up after they slipped a bit. They all stared at him. Nothing beats science. He shrugged, still clearly thinking that explained everything.
Indeed,
she said, letting the subject rest.
You all know why we're here. We've got a situation in the Irigoyen sector, and it doesn't look pretty. As we speak, Fleet Admiral Oppenheimer is on Britannia preparing the main IDF defense fleet for major combat operations. But we're being sent in as soon as possible to gather intel, scout out the enemy, and hopefully stop it before it can do any more damage.
Captain Prucha stirred. What kind of damage are we looking at here?
The entire world of Irigoyen Prime has gone dark. All communications are out. No ships out of the system since yesterday morning. We've also got spotty intel from the Dolmasi. Turns out they've lost a few colonies, and if reports can be believed, Verdra Dal has gone dark as well.
Verdra Dal? Isn't that the closest thing to a home world that they've got? Said Captain Prucha.
It's their second most populous world, yes, replied Proctor. And the latest intel report from Oppenheimer came in just a few minutes ago. Bolivar, the second largest world in the Irigoyen sector, reported sighting an unknown vessel entering the system just a few hours ago. Since then, nothing. Not a single metaspace signal has gotten through.
Silence around the conference table as they all considered the gravity of the situation.
Not a single message? From the entire world? The orbital defense platform? Said Captain Valls.
Captain Prucha whistled. That must be some ship. Reminds me of the swarm when they first attacked 30 years ago. Remember the first incursions? All the systems went dark. They were able to disrupt all communications with their Russian-borrowed singularity tech. Are we certain this threat is not the swarm? Proctor shook her head. She almost wished it was the swarm. At least that was an enemy she knew how to deal with, as deadly as they were. But she'd led the mission that had destroyed the last known swarm carrier 25 years ago, effectively putting an end to their entire race. A whole species, gone with the press of a button. The war had been over for years, and the remaining swarm carriers were mostly dormant, since Granger had closed the black hole they were being controlled through. But still, CENTCOM had insisted that each remaining carrier be utterly destroyed. So she destroyed. No. The threat signature doesn't match anything we ever saw from them. This is new, as far as we can tell. The ship description is unlike anything we've seen. Their tech, what little we know about it, is advanced, and the worst part might be something we've never encountered before. She glanced over at Commander Mumford. He cleared his throat. Before Irigoyen Prime went dark, there were widespread reports of civil unrest in the cities. Which cities? Said Captain Prucha. Mumford shrugged. All of them. Fighting, arson, murders. It was like the entire surface just went up in the flames of riots and thuggery just before the unknown ship struck. And once it struck, that was the last we heard. Admiral Proctor nodded and continued for him.
We've hypothesized that the aliens are using some sort of EM wave, possibly metaspace enhanced, that somehow influences organic neural pathways and brain chemical structure, inducing some kind of psychotropic response.
Proctor looked around at all their faces and saw understanding suddenly dawn on them. The unasked question had probably been nagging them the entire time, she knew. Why her? Why turn to the ousted former fleet admiral, who was happily spending her retirement in the classroom and on the beach?
Yes, that is the main reason they called me up. Due to my extensive experience studying xenobiology and my years of direct interaction with all things swarm, Dulmasi, Sciora, and every other alien race we've encountered.
Reyna muttered,
Like hell, Captain. They're calling you up for more than that. You're a goddamn hero. The closest thing United Earth has to one, if you don't mind my truth speaking.
Proctor smiled but held up a hand.
Thank you, Reyna. But we all know that all the heroes are dead, she replied,
using an oft-quoted aphorism of the Second Swarm War.
They died saving Earth last time around. I'm just a gal that knows a thing or two about commanding a starship and a little extra experience dealing with aliens. Tim Granger was the real hero. God rest his soul.
Her staff, old faces and new, beamed back at her. Many of them had been to hell and back at her side. As for the others, she assumed Admiral Oppenheimer had given her the best of the best.
We T-jump out within the hour. I want final readiness reports in 30. Dismissed.
Don't you mean tranny jump? Said Valls with a lopsided grin. I mean, let's call it what it—
Admiral Proctor, bridge.
Bacom interrupted him. Proctor touched the glowing indicator on the conference table.
Go ahead, bridge. Sir, we've just received a metaspace distress call from Orbital Defense Platform Watchdog orbiting Bolivar. They say they've, and I quote, engaged the Golgothics. It's not entirely clear what they mean by that, Admiral. So, the Bolivarans have given the aliens a name already? Golgothics?
Lieutenant Corty, his voice tinged by a heavy southern drawl, raised a finger. Ma'am, if I may. Grew up on Bolivar myself. Old Bolivaran legend, or rather a campfire story you'd tell to scare the pants off each other. They're supposed to be a race of unholy terrors that make you feel your worst emotions, all multiplied and enhanced till you're good right batty. Eat your supper or the Golgothics will eat you, my grandmam always said. Of course, she was half coon crazy herself.
Proctor snorted. That name will do for now, I suppose.
She raised her head toward the comm.
Thank you, Bridge.
She eyed them all.
Let's move.
Chapter 6. Britannia System, Calais. Wellington Shipyards. Bridge, ISS Independence.
T-jump in 5, ma'am,
said Ensign Risa. Proctor gripped her armrests in preparation. She had no reason to assume the T-jump would be qualitatively any different than the Q-jump, which was basically undetectable to the senses, but her careful instincts set her on edge.
Initiating.
The view on the screen covering the front half of the bridge shifted from a serene display of the giant red clouds of Calais to a star-speckled canvas of black, open interstellar space. It had been years since Proctor had seen it, and had almost forgotten how free it felt. It reminded her of how sea captains must have felt as they lost all sight of land, seeing only the unending swell of distant waves. Proctor's ears popped.
The hell was that?
She craned her neck around to look at Commander Yarbrough.
Normal, ma'am. The T-jump is a bit more intense than the Q-jump. We did just travel 5 light years after all.
Proctor opened and closed her jaw to relieve the pressure differential.
But why the pressure change? Just an artifact of the T-jump process. Due to the extreme distance involved, the less dense matter arrives first, in our case the atmosphere, just a fraction of a second. But the individual speeds of the air molecules are high enough that when the rest of us appear, the internal ship pressure has dropped by a small amount.
Proctor glanced at Science Chief Mumford, who shrugged.
Well, that's unnerving, she said. There's no chance things could get out of hand and we suddenly lose all pressure on one of these jumps.
Commander Yarbrough shook his head.
No, sir. We've run the numbers on our T-jump simulations for years, and the chances of that happening are less than 5 sigmas of standard deviation from the mean. If you'd like, I can run a few additional Monte Carlo simulations and determine a better regression. Thank you, Commander, she said, cutting him off.
She remembered being a little uptight herself back when she was a fresh commander, seeking to stand out, but she already found his eager-to-please attitude tiresome.
Let's focus on the emergency at hand.
She turned back to Ensign Risa.
Time until next Q-jump. Just a few seconds, sir.
The same unnerving feeling washed over Proctor as her ears popped and the star field on the screen shifted almost imperceptibly.
Not sure I'm going to get used to that.
The jumps ticked by, and within 10 minutes Ensign Risa announced,
Last T-jump.
Proctor nodded.
All hands to battle stations. Sound red alert.
She motioned over to Captain Prucha to begin battle readiness operations.
Magrel stations, commence loading operations. Laser turret crews, prime initiators and start auto-targeting sequences. Emergency crews, stand by to prepare for damage control and casualties.
He went down his readiness checklist while Proctor clicked the comm over to the CIC on the fighter deck.
Balzi, everything ready down there?
Yes, ma'am. Got a pretty green crew down here, but the squad leaders are veterans at least. No one has seen actual combat, except me, of course, he added offhandedly. I would have thought that with a new experimental starship, we'd get new experimental fighters.
Problem?
Not at all. These old Dex-25s are solid workhorses. I wouldn't ask for anything more. Just let me know the plan when we get there, Shelby.
Stand by, Ballsy. 1 T-jump left. Have all fighters ready to launch. All stations report ready, Admiral, said Captain Prucha.
She nodded. The old, swelling feeling of pre-battle adrenaline surged into her chest. This was the part of command that she both hated and missed. The feeling of urgency and clarity that preceded an impending battle. The awful feeling that some of them might die, that she might lose people under her command. But it was invigorating, nonetheless. Nothing in academia or the rest of her experience came close to replicating the feeling. It was like a drug. She felt guilty for enjoying, yet looked forward to the next fix.
Initiate final T-jump.
The screen shifted, and in place of a brilliant star field, appeared a blue and white dappled world, with a strike terminator separating night and day on the surface. Bolivar. And on the night side of the planet, the surface burned. Chapter 7. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Bridge, ISS Independence. Something inside her snapped. Something latent and visceral. Proctor gasped. For the briefest moment, images of scores of eviscerated Skura flashed before her eyes. Their small, alien blue bodies torn. Their thousands of embryos stored within their bodies oozing red blood. As if she were momentarily transported to a waking nightmare. But the next moment, her vision snapped back to the rising smoke plumes on the planet below. What the hell was that? She turned to the tactical crew. Lieutenant Whitehorse, scan the surface. What the hell are we seeing? Something odd about the woman. The tactical officer was staring at her console, her face muscles occasionally making twitching or jerking motions, as if she were having a minor seizure. Lieutenant, she repeated. Whitehorse shook her head. Yes, ma'am. The officer focused on her data console, her face still screwed up as if in intense concentration. But she finally shook herself out of whatever had come over her. Widespread fires on the surface, mainly from the densely populated areas, the cities, towns, anywhere with a high concentration of people. Lots of fires. Some have spread to the forests. Why? No idea, ma'am. She turned back to the view screen covering the front of the bridge. The fires themselves weren't actually visible on the day side of the Terminator, since they were orbiting over 500 kilometers above the surface, but the sight of the giant plumes of smoke rising from the cities was disturbing, to say the least. And she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of... What the hell was she feeling? Fear? Anger? Something inside of her was writhing, raging, seething to the surface, making her either want to lash out or run or both. She balled her fists and bit her lip in an attempt to ground herself. Scan all orbits. Search for the alien vessel. Scanning, said Whitehorse. She reached up and scratched furiously at the back of her neck. Proctor could see the hand shake. Damn, they could all feel it too. Something was wrong. Proctor wheeled around to face Commander Yarbrough. Now's the time, Commander. Where the hell are all the newfangled defensive capabilities you were talking about? Admiral? The man looked puzzled. We're being hit with... something. It's affecting our brain chemistry, can't you feel it? Yarbrough paused, looking down at his arms as if in a moment of introspection. I suppose I could catalog my feelings and compare them to prior baseline feelings, though I haven't been as diligent at cataloging my feelings lately. Proctor couldn't tell if the man was joking or not. Yarbrough hadn't seemed like the type to ever kid, and so the remark made even less sense. Whatever the aliens or Golgothics were hitting them with, it was clearly affecting him too. His eyes darted back and forth over his handheld datapad, and he spoke almost twice as fast as he usually did. I suppose if I tapped into the ship's medical logs and compiled a spreadsheet of baseline neurotransmitter levels and kept a running log of Commander, snap out of it. We need to block this, whatever it is. What can the Independents do for us? Yarbrough's eyes continued darting back and forth, and he was at a loss for words. Flustered, Proctor spun around to the comm station. Ensign Qwerty, Billy Bob, interrupted the man. Proctor closed her eyes in annoyance and struggled not to lash out. Surely that was a normal response to the officer's breach of decorum. Ensign Billy Bob Qwerty, are you reading anything on regular channels? No, ma'am, he began, his voice heavily tinged by a deep American South accent. He was either from Ganymede or Alabama. All the comm channels quieter than a hibernating coon. Broaden the spectrum. Look at the whole band. Adjust harmonics to look for metaspace carrier frequencies. Yes'm. Any idea what I'm looking for, Admiral? He twanged. At least his fingers were dancing deftly over the console. Anything. She had to keep herself from rolling her eyes. Commander Yarbrough had assured her that Ensign Qwerty was the best of the best. Polyglot, linguist, a virtual communication genius. But all she could see and hear was a redneck and... Was that... chew bulging in his cheek? Shit. Before she lashed out at him, was that a normal feeling? She turned to Mumford, the boxer turned science chief. Can we disrupt it, whatever it is? He shrugged, his massive shoulders bouncing up, mirrored by his eyebrows. We can't block it if we don't even know what it is.
We could try the new anti-laser EM shielding, said Yarbrough, apparently in a moment of clarity. Though I'd be more comfortable if I could compile a list of failure modes and run a few Monte Carlo simulations on it. Proctor snapped her finger. She remembered the new shielding back from her days as Fleet Admiral of IDF. In fact, if she remembered correctly, the signature authorizing the release of funding for the project was hers. The research and deployment must have finally happened. Brilliant, she said, cutting Yarbrough off and pointing to Mumford. Could it work? I mean, assuming this signal, whatever it is EM-based. Mumford, in spite of being the science chief, was built like a bull. His shoulders heaved as he lifted his hands to his terminal. Damn, why was she so fixated on those shoulders? Those huge, meaty shoulders rippling like... Yarbrough kept right on speaking, not even giving Mumford the chance to reply, his mousy features and flimsy mustache reminding Proctor of some old television caricature of a dopey, nameless worrywart. Someone who usually ate it when the monster or the alien or the big bad showed up. Admiral, I strongly protest. If we want to use the EM shielding for something other than its intended purpose, we need to run tests. We need benchmarks, baselines, error analysis. We can't get sloppy, especially now with our lives on the line. Proctor just stared at him. What the hell was he talking about? Running engineering tests now, in the middle of a red alert all-hands-to-battle station situation? She shook her head and glanced back at Mumford, who was himself looking skeptically, scornfully, at Yarbrough, his broad shoulders bulging underneath the too tight uniform. Shit, they were all going crazy, herself included. But no, not exactly crazy, just exaggerated. Whatever this was, it seemed to be amplifying whatever their basest and most fundamental mental processes were compelling them to do, amplifying and hyperbolizing their thoughts. For Yarbrough, it was amplifying his urge to cross the T's and dot the I's, to proceed with maximum safety, to understand whatever threat they faced in gory, unnecessary detail. For Mumford, well, who knew what he was feeling? He seemed to be acting very hesitantly, at least in spite of those beefcake shoulders, while Proctor herself seemed overly focused on doing something, anything. But that was rational, right? Was that her only tick? The doing something? And the shoulders? A voice came from right behind her. Captain Prucha had crept over to the captain's chair and spoke near her ear. We need to get the hell out of here. Now. Leave? She turned to face him. Are you suggesting we just turn tail and run? We're supposed to be the rescuers, remember? Prucha's face was tightening by the second, his brow furrowed more than she'd ever seen it. He seemed on the verge of screaming at her. We can't be the rescuers if we go crazy, Shelby. Our ability to render aid is severely curtailed if we can't even trust our own judgment skills. But we're all these people have. His eyes twitched even more. We are steering the most advanced warship humanity has ever known towards one of the most populated planets in United Earth space. Do we really want our twitchy fingers on the triggers of these new weapons? He had a point. And the overwhelming feelings she, and all of them, were experiencing could just be the tip of the iceberg. Judging from the thousands of fires ravaging the surface, things could get a whole lot worse. On the other hand, they had to do something. They had a mission. They were people to save, a planet to save, hell, a civilization to save. If what she was seeing down on the surface was all caused by the alien ship, then this was not only a threat, but an existential threat. Any progress locking down that signal spectrum? She said to no one in particular while she watched the surface burn. No, ma'am, said Lieutenant Whitehorse as a new alarm sounded in the background. But now reading a sensor contact coming on fast. She looked up, her face flushed red, probably from holding in an outburst of some kind. It's the alien ship. It'll be here in 2 minutes.
Chapter 8. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Watchdog Station, high orbit. When Lieutenant Civic woke up, he wished he hadn't. His head throbbed, he had no idea why, though as he lifted his head from the deck plate, his cheek stuck to the surface. A probing finger revealed his face was covered in blood. Likely his head too, if the pain back there was any indication. A glance to his left told him that Commander Smith had fared worse. A hole where his face had been didn't bode well for the man's health. "That shouldn't be there," he mumbled, gaping at the bloody space where Smith's nose, skull, and brain should have been. The gore still hadn't registered as something real to his mind. It was like watching a movie. He knew he should be repulsed. He knew he should be doubled over and vomiting at the sight of the gruesome scene. But all he could think about was trying to remember what was going on. He tried to remember what had happened before he blacked out, but failed. There was a battle. Weapons fire. With whom? His head hurt too badly to remember. Klaxons, alarms, shouting. Everything in the background was chaos. Was the battle still going on? Groaning, he pushed himself to his knees and tried to stand. As he swayed, he caught sight of a hole in the bulkhead, about the same size as the hole in Smith's face. A shimmering field covered the opening, an emergency measure to prevent the loss of atmosphere. But emergency hull containment fields were energy-intensive, and if it wasn't physically patched soon, the field would fail and expose the room to vacuum. At that thought, the room spun and he doubled over again, vomiting all over his boots. He glanced to his left at the gory sight of Smith's former face and felt his mouth water again, before another fit of vomiting overtook him. Reality was starting to set in. The foul aroma of alcohol and stomach acid assaulted his nose and pierced the hazy veil over his memory. He'd been drinking. Heavily. And he was starting to remember why. The ship. He jumped to his feet, suppressing another wave of nausea, and slid into his chair at the command station. Where was the ship? A quick glance over the sensor data revealed no unknown contacts within hundreds of kilometers, just a few hundred ships over Bolivar in various stages of falling through the atmosphere. Merchant freighters, cargo carriers, military patrol ships, colonial transports, all of them, almost every single one, either burned through the atmosphere or were falling quickly towards it. A few lucky ships appeared to be in stable orbits around Bolivar, along with Watchdog Station. The planet wasn't faring any better than the ships. Smoke billowed up from the major towns, dozens of kilometers into the atmosphere, some forming great mushroom clouds, as if nuclear explosions had flattened entire cities. Did the governments of Bolivar have secret tactical nukes? Or were those from the alien ship? Where the hell was that ship? He tapped into the planetary sensor network, giving him access to data from the other side of the planet, and, sure enough, a weather satellite confirmed the presence of the unknown vessel orbiting slowly. The defensive satellites seemed to be all knocked out or disabled. The ship seemed to glide right on by, without a single defensive shot from the defense network. It was headed towards another ship, an IDF ship, one he didn't recognize. He keyed in a command to read the ship's transponder, ISS Independence. Never heard of it. He shook his head. The earlier conflicting emotions had subsided. Fear still threatened to paralyze him, and the urge to liquor up still gnawed at him, but for the most part, his head was clear. Did those feelings, did they come from that alien ship? Luckily, it was on the other side of the planet now. The sensor readout changed. Something was happening. The distinct signature of weapons fire, though he couldn't tell who was shooting. Perhaps both the Independence and the alien ship. All he knew was that the power readings from the Independence were starting to fluctuate. Shit, they needed help. Otherwise, they'd end up just like Watchdog Station, broken and bleeding. As if to punctuate his thought, another klaxon sounded in the distance. Another hull breach. The energy field over the hole in the bulkhead nearby started to shimmer and fluctuate. If there were more of those holes in other parts of the station, say a few dozen, then the power draw to maintain atmospheric integrity would be substantial. And a quick glance at the operations console monitor nearby told him even more bad news. The station's reactor was going critical. Whereas before he was worried that they'd be dead within the hour, now he knew he had only a few minutes if he was going to do anything at all. And from the station he could do very little. It was really only one choice at this point, and though it was the one choice he dreaded. But given the alternative, it was all he had. He hadn't flown a ship for over a year. He'd sworn he wouldn't ever again. Watchdog Station had a handful of fighters stationed in its bay, and a quick glance at another readout on his console told him that all of them were disabled, except for 2. The rest had holes in them the same size as the hole in Smith's face. In fact, the entire bay was at vacuum. The fighter pilots on standby could be dead for all he knew. His stomach seemed to lurch into his mouth and his head spun again. Though at the sight of a coffee mug flying past his face, he knew this wasn't just his queasiness again. Artificial gravity was out. The rest of life support would probably soon follow. If he was going to do this, it had to be now. Launching himself out of his seat, he swore as he collided with the ceiling. Damn it. His Zero-G training certification had lapsed earlier in the year. He hated Zero-G. He hated all Gs that weren't regular G. It was part of why he'd turned in his fighter pilot wings a year ago, much to the chagrin of his father. If his mother were still alive, he imagined she'd kick his ass. Flying fighters was in his blood. It was his heritage. It was the family business, it seemed. And he'd turned his back on it, and on his dead mother, and his living and livid father. He shook his head clear of the collision with the ceiling and pushed himself towards the door. Luckily, it sensed his impending approach and slid open at the last second, allowing him to sail through into the hallway beyond, though he needed to make a last-minute adjustment to his trajectory to avoid crashing into the limp body of Commander Smith, which had floated up, along with dozens of globules of his blood. One of the floating red spheres splashed onto his shoulder as he passed, making his stomach churn again. "You can do this, Civic, you can do this, Civic," he chanted to himself over and over again like a mantra. He flew down the ruined hallway, seeing an occasional hole in the floor. When he glanced up, he saw a matching hole in the ceiling. Beyond each, he could see the chaos in the deck below or above. At one, he paused to look through the oval-shaped hole, peering through at least 4 decks worth of destruction, terminating in a hole of exactly the same shape in the exterior bulkhead. Stars twinkled on the other side of the shimmering blue screen. Shit, I've got no time. At the lift, he pushed the call button, but nothing happened. He wondered if the lifts depended on the artificial gravity system, but even as he thought it, he realized he didn't need the lift. Keying in the emergency override code, the door slid open, but stopped halfway. With effort, he managed to push it back into its sleeve, and he pulled himself into the empty elevator shaft. Luckily, the lift seemed to be stuck above him, though with the Zero-G he now thought of that direction as behind him, and he sailed forward through the shaft, counting the decks down until he arrived at the fighter bay. With another override entry and more grunting, he managed to force the door open and push himself into the antechamber of the bay, which, luckily, was not at vacuum. Distant explosions punctuated his panic. Was that the core? No, if that were the core exploding, he wouldn't be here right now. Nevertheless, another explosion, this one close enough to make him instinctually cover his ears, pushed him to hurry even more. Except that wasn't an explosion. It was a gunshot. Who the hell was shooting a gun on a station whose core was about to go critical? Had that mysterious ship dropped off a boarding party? But the questions could wait for now, since shouting voices nearby made him dash for an armaments container in the corner. He yanked it open and swore under his breath. He'd been hoping to find at least a sidearm there, if not an assault rifle. It was completely empty. The voices were getting louder. With no other choices left, he pulled himself into the container and yanked the lid mostly shut, leaving just enough of a space to see out into the launch bay's anteroom. He'd hid just in time. The door into corridor slid open, and a man, handcuffed and thrashing, flew through and collided into the far wall, bounced off, and drifted back towards the door. He was wearing a contractor's uniform, probably from one of the commercial vendors that regularly serviced the station. 2 other men, both in IDF uniforms, appeared at the door, and as the flailing, handcuffed man sailed back towards them, one of the newcomers bashed his face with the sidearm he was holding. The handcuffed man started spinning, blood flinging off his face in all directions. "Last chance, Underwood. Where is it? This is the last time I ask." The man with the gun leveled it at the bound contractor's head, who was now being held in place by the other IDF officer. Civic didn't recognize any of them. The Watchdog station was pretty large, hosting over 300 IDF personnel and contractors at any given time. The contractor struggled against the handcuffs, but it was a futile effort. "You people are freaks. This place is going to blow, and all you care about is the—" Another blow to the face from the sidearm silenced him. "Last chance." The man holding the gun checked the safety and then pointed it at the man's forehead. The other officer let go of the contractor and pushed himself away, up toward the ceiling, and then back down to the floor to float next to the officer with the gun. The contractor swore under his breath. "Fine. It's already loaded onto one of the shuttles." "So you lied to me earlier?" The contractor was getting frantic as he watched the barrel of the gun pointed between his eyes. "I had orders. You have to understand. I have orders too." But he smiled and lowered the gun. "You passed the test, my friend. I knew it was on the shuttle already." He started to push the gun into his belt, fingering the safety on. "We may just take you with us. Save your life, you know. Pay you back for finally coming around to see reason. A reward, you see." The contractor breathed a little easier and nodded vigorously. "I need the authorization code to open the shuttle. What is it?" He peered out through the thick composite glass windows into the actual shuttle bay. "And which shuttle is it?" "Shuttle Fenway. Code is Fenway Bravo Sholvik Orion 112. A distant explosion shook the room, and the contractor eyed the walls nervously. Please, hurry. We've got to get out of here." The man with the gun nodded. "Agreed." He pulled the gun out, flipped the safety off, and shot the contractor through the forehead. The body jerked once and started somersaulting backward, blood trailing out from the head in a spiral as the corpse slowly rotated. "Let's go." The man nodded at his companion, holstered the gun, and they both sailed over to the fighter pilot's lockers, searching until they found flight suits and helmets. "Bays at vacuum. Be ready for explosive decompression." Civic tried not to gasp, but he knew what was coming. And before he could even breathe deeply a few times to prepare, the whole room exploded in a rush of air as the thick doors opened into the shuttle bay. Chapter 9. Irigoyen Sector. Bolivar System, Bolivar. Bridge, ISS Independence. "It's firing at us, sir," yelled Lieutenant Whitehorse. Proctor spun around to face the screen, her eyes darting back and forth across the other vessel, searching for the expected energy beam or whatever the Golgothics used for their weapons. "With what?" The entire deck jolted under their feet. "With that," said Whitehorse. "They've got mag rails, but holy shit. Spit it out, Lieutenant. These are mag rail slugs, all right, but they're bigger than anything I've ever seen. At least 100 kilos each and solid iron, and they're going faster than, well, anything I've ever seen. 50 kps at least." Proctor's eyes bulged. 100 kilos accelerated up to 50 kps in the space of a few milliseconds? The power required to achieve such a feat was formidable. Terawatts at least. "Damage! Blew a hole clean through Independence, Admiral," said Captain Prucha. "Receiving reports of casualties on several decks. Hull containment is compromised, but backups are in place." "It's firing again," yelled Whitehorse. The deck lurched and bucked. Proctor grabbed her chair and pulled herself into it, fastening the restraints to keep herself from flying out. For the last dozen years or so of her career as an IDF captain, she had served aboard legacy fleet ships. Constitution, Warrior, Victory, Chesapeake. Massive behemoths that couldn't shake so much. The Independence was far smaller, far lighter, and she could feel it in the tremors in the deck plate. "All mag-rail crews, target the vessel and open fire. Laser crews, same, open the hell up on that thing." "Aye, ma'am." Lieutenant Whitehorse signaled to her tactical crew, coordinating firing patterns.
All mag rails engaged. Lasers... She frowned. Lasers having no effect, sir. They're just bouncing right off.
Proctor snapped her head towards Captain Yarbrough.
You said those are terawatt lasers. They are. And how the hell can that blasted thing out there repel a terawatt beam?
She watched a video feed, and indeed the laser beams, rather than turn the other ship into glowing slag or a rapidly expanding cloud of vapor, just bounced off like the Independence was shining handheld pointer lasers at the other ship.
And the magrail slugs.
She watched the video feed, but she knew she'd never see the damn things going over 10 kilometers per second.
They're, also bouncing off, ma'am.
Whitehorse's brow furrowed.
I don't understand. They shouldn't do that. Ever.
Impossible.
Are the mag rail calibrations off? Are they moving at the right speed? The only way a slug bounces off is if it's only moving very slowly. No, ma'am.
Whitehorse pounded the console in frustration as another burst of slugs shot out from the Independence and bounced off faster than they could see.
I don't understand it, sir. It's almost like there's different physics governing that hull over there. Terawatt beams of photons and slugs of tungsten don't bounce off any surface, no matter how well engineered it is.
An explosion tore through the rear of the bridge, sending Captain Prucha flying forward, along with 2 ops technicians. They landed in a crumpled pile after hitting the front wall. Proctor ripped the seat restraint away and ran towards them, but she could see immediately there was nothing she could do. Prucha bled profusely from his neck, and it seemed his head was only half attached. All 3 officers were completely scorched. Admiral Proctor's breath caught in her throat. It had been decades since she'd seen such visceral gore and violence, and with the sight of the erupting blood came the memories of the Second Swarm War, rushing back to overwhelm her.
Ensign Risa, get us out of here. Ma'am?
It was a retreat, but there was no choice. They'd be picked apart without so much as touching the mysterious ship.
Now! Any heading!
Proctor supposed that the inertial cancellors were damaged because she nearly fell down as the Independence started speeding away from the Golgothic ship, shooting eastward above the upper atmosphere of Bolivar. Smart move, she thought. If they were to lose engines, orbiting in the same direction as the planet's spin would make a crash landing that much easier.
Pursuit!
Whitehorse shook her head.
None. The alien ship is proceeding along its heading, as if we'd never met it. Course? Looks like it's heading out toward Ido, Bolivar's moon. Ido? What the hell would it want with Ido? 1 billion people on Bolivar, and how many on Ido?
She looked over to Commander Yarbrough with her brow raised in a question.
A few hundred, tops. It's only used as a ship supply depot and transfer point.
Proctor turned back to look at the dead Captain Prucha. Had served for years together on the Chesapeake. He was her confidant, her rock during the most difficult days of that assignment. But she forced the tears back and swallowed the growing lump at the back of her throat. Mourn later, survive now. At the back of her mind, she thought it was remarkable how the old survival instincts she'd developed during the Second Swarm War 30 years ago came back so readily, like riding a bicycle. Except this bicycle was on fire, made of dynamite, and she was speeding over a cliff. Her ship status schematic on her command console was a sea of flashing red.
Does IDF have any defense assets out at Ido?
Commander Yarbrough shook his head.
Barely. Just a single orbiting defense platform, a couple mag rails, crew of 20, tops.
Madam Admiral, think you should see this, ma'am. The comm chief, Lieutenant Corty, was waving her down. The urgency of the situation was exacerbating his southern twang. Picking up a shitload of comm chatter on IDF frequencies.
What is it?
Sounds like Admiral Mullins down in CENTCOM Bolivar finally managed to muster his planetary defense fleet. They had been dispersed throughout the sector helping with relief operations for Sangre de Cristo. But there's a slight problem. What could possibly make this situation worse?
I'm sure we can handle it.
Corty nodded. Much of Bolivar's defense fleet has mustered at Ido to face the Golgothic ship. But from the sound of things, several of the captains have, declared for the GPC and are threatening to shoot any IDF vessel that intervenes. Chapter 10. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Ido. Bridge, ISS Independence.
Are they crazy?
Proctor asked, turning to look at the schematic map of the fleet layout, which showed the ships arrayed at Ido. Several of the blue icons had turned red, indicating which ones had supposedly declared for the GPC. Commander Yarbrough came up behind her.
They actually could be crazy, judging from the effects from that alien ship. I confess, when that ship was close to us, I half wanted to take over the helm and get us out of there, and, well, half wanted to grab the nearest gun and blow my own head off. I was so scared.
She looked back at him and nodded.
I agree. It was harrowing, but this is different. I didn't sign up to rein in a bunch of separatist malcontents.
She turned back to the screen.
I don't care what that alien ship is doing to their judgment. They'd better stand down now, or face a very angry former fleet admiral,
she added under her breath.
Do we have time to babysit a bunch of scared IDF captains?
Yarbrough asked.
Or fight a civil war? Because that's what this looks like. You don't take over an IDF warship and think United Earth is going to come after you with kid gloves.
She approached Ensign Risa at the helm.
Get us out there. T-jump. Put us right in the middle of the ships that haven't declared for the GPC. Aye, ma'am.
Moments later, she felt the now familiar vertigo from the T-jump, and the view screen shifted to reveal Bolivar's planetary defense fleet, with the gray regolith of Ido behind them. Almost immediately, the earlier feelings of raw fear, rage, lust, and terror returned. The Golgothic ship was near.
Open a channel to the whole fleet, she said.
Cordy nodded. Open, Admiral.
All IDF ships. This is Admiral Shelby Proctor, acting under the direct authority of Fleet Admiral Oppenheimer. As you're all well aware, we're under attack.
She clenched her jaw, weighing her next words carefully, which was 10 times more difficult under the influence of the Golgothic's emotion-disrupting broadcast.
I'm under the impression that several captains have chosen this moment to declare their political leanings. This is unacceptable, especially in the face of an existential threat that we face in the form of that alien ship. While we don't understand yet its intentions, I think we can assume.
The comm erupted with a booming voice that interrupted her. Admiral Proctor, please spare us your speech. We've suffered under the oppressive regime of United Earth for too long to have to suffer through the empty threats of a washed-up, former wannabe war hero. Proctor's face flushed red with anger. On the split screen, she saw the Golgothic vessel was approaching the moon and their fleet. They had minutes at best to prepare themselves, and here she was arguing with a political idealist who was under the influence. She glanced at the fleet layout schematic and noted the captain's name and ship.
Captain Shi, I presume. Look, Captain, we can discuss your political grievances later, but what matters now is that you bring the Davenport with us into battle with the alien ship. Our very survival depends on it.
Lieutenant Whitehorse called from the tactical station.
Admiral, they're arming mag rail and laser turrets. Targeting computers are locking onto us. Oh, for the love... Risa, move us away. Get us in orbit around Ido on a course that won't pass us anywhere near these assholes.
She motioned towards the comm station for Corty to open up the channel to the entire fleet.
All IDF ships who are willing and able, follow the Independence to Ido to intercept the alien ship. Any IDF vessel that chooses not to engage with us will face severe repercussions when this is over. Proctor out.
On the screen, the intransigent IDF vessels shrunk to small white dots as the Independence accelerated away, accompanied by over half of the Bolivaran fleet. They started swinging around the moon, passing the Terminator and into the darkness of Ido's night. After a minute or so, the sense of rage and dread induced by the Golgothics dissipated to just a background murmur, like shadowy fears in the corners of her mind.
Risa, increase speed to 10 kps. We're going to slingshot around the moon and hit it with a barrage of magrail slugs.
She sat down in the captain's chair and fastened the restraints.
Granger's favorite move, she muttered.
I thought his favorite move was hurling other starships into swarm carriers, said Yarbrough. She shrugged.
They did call him the bricklayer for all the bricks he sent through the swarm's windows. Starships were expendable to him. To me, they're not.
She glanced up at Yarbrough.
Yet.
But the memory of Granger's unorthodox tactics gave her an idea. If Captain Shi and his cohort were going to get in the way of her tactical operations...
Ensign Risa, adjust our heading. Come up on the alien ship from the direction of the rebels. Reduce speed until we're right up under their noses.
Ma'am, that's going to expose us to their fire, said Whitehorse.
Yes,
she said, gripping her armrests.
But it will also let us use them as a shield.
Chapter 11. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Watchdog Station, High Orbit. Civic gripped the storage locker so hard that the edges dug into his palms, but mercifully the maelstrom of air, debris, and the contractor's blood ceased soon after it began, as the bay doors shut behind the two officers. He counted to 10 before launching himself out of the container. The station was going to blow any second. He had to balance that impending death with the possibility of being seen by the two unknown assassins, who would surely kill any potential witnesses to their crime. What were they looking for? Why was it worth killing for? He didn't have time to think about it. He ripped one of the fighter pilot lockers open, empty, except for a few personal effects. The next 3 lockers also showed no signs of a flight gear, or any other kind of emergency environmental suit that would let him survive the hard vacuum of the bay. The last locker, marked Johnson, bore fruit. He wondered where Lieutenant Johnson was as he pulled the man's suit on, locking the seals in place and struggling to squeeze into something that was obviously meant for a slightly smaller man, a situation made worse by the fact that he was floating in the air, pulling the suit on without any leverage from gravity. He rammed the helmet onto his head. Stickers, insignia, and graffiti covered the exterior of the well-worn helmet, but it looked serviceable. The oxygen indicator suggested the reserves were full, and the power backups were at full charge. Thank God for the diligence of maintenance crews. And Shovik Orion, military equipment supplier extraordinaire. He hadn't even locked the helmet seal in place when the pressure in the antechamber blew again, this time because of a hull containment force field that had failed. The air in the room flooded towards a hole in the wall, separating him from the bay, and any object in the room not nailed down suddenly became a deadly projectile. But projectiles weren't his immediate concern. He gasped as the air thinned and he struggled against the fierce wind to seal the helmet. At the moment, he felt like his lungs were about to burst into his mouth and his eyes pop. He managed to crank the seal shut, and the oxygen system automatically engaged as it sensed the near-vacuum condition of the suit. That was too close, he told himself, pushing away from the locker towards the door to the bay. The override code unlocked the door, but it didn't even move. Emergency power reserves were probably completely drained, as evidenced by the lack of a shimmering blue screen over the hole in the bulkhead. He managed to wedge some fingers into the opening and forced the doors open inch by inch, though these were far heavier than the lift doors he'd forced earlier. Finally, 12 inches later, it was open just enough to let him squeeze through. Debris, hydraulic fluid, ordnance, tools, and bodies all floated in the bay, obstructing the path in between him and the 2 operable fighters at the end of the flight platform. He didn't know if the surrounding chaos was the result of the 2 mysterious assassins, or the earlier bombardment from the equally mysterious ship. But a quick glance at the giant bay doors that opened out into deep space told him that the 2 murderers had left. The shuttle they piloted careened out the doors, which started to close behind the small craft. Before it darted out, he just barely caught sight of the nameplate affixed to the rear. Fenway. As another explosion registered in the background, he launched himself straight through the debris. In the back of his mind, he realized he didn't actually hear the explosion, but holding onto the bay doors, he'd felt it, and feeling the vibration through the metal seemed to create the perception of sound in his head. From the state of the bodies, it was clear the emergency had taken them completely by surprise. None of the techs were wearing the environmental suits that would have saved their lives, and the pilots were all helmetless, their partially donned flight suits insufficient to save them from the vacuum. He tried not to look at their bloated purple faces as he passed. except for one, which had a helmet on and was flailing and thrashing around several meters off the deck. She was terrified, and calculating the risk in his head, he decided to take it. Better die with honor than live with the shame. He bounced off a tumbling barrel full of lubricant grease and used the collision to redirect himself upward towards the woman. They collided. He grabbed her upper arm, and as they hit the ceiling, he pushed off with a grunt, aiming for one of the remaining craft, and prayed that his aim while maneuvering in zero-G was as good as it was with the fire controls of a fighter. It was. They nearly bounced off, but at the last second he grabbed the small handhold near the hatch with his free hand, wrenching the flailing woman towards the fighter with his other. The hatch to the fighter opened far easier than any of the doors he'd opened so far, and a quick glance over the controls told him the craft was in good shape. Whatever had barraged the station had fortunately missed this particular bird. He pushed the woman into the space behind the seat, secured her as best he could with the auxiliary restraint, strapped himself in, fired up the engines, and pulled away from the deck with a quick burst from the maneuvering thrusters, tapping the button that would have opened the exterior bay doors. They didn't budge. Of course, he thought. That would be far too easy. He keyed in an override code for the doors, but they still didn't move. After all that work, he was stuck in the bay. An alarm sounded from his helmet's headset, and he glanced at his console to see what the new emergency was. The core. It was going critical. He had maybe 15 seconds, 20 tops. Soon the entire station and everything inside would be nothing more than a glowing cloud of molten radioactive slag. He gripped the firing control, aimed the guns at the bay door, and fired with everything the little bird had. Out the corner of his eye, he saw something move. One of the floating bodies. A pilot. His helmet was on, and the man was struggling to maneuver in the debris field floating over the bay's deck, unable to get enough leverage to launch himself towards the remaining fighter. Civic glanced at the console even as he continued pummeling the doors with shells. 10 seconds. He caught sight of the other pilot's face as he rotated into view, contorted in sheer terror. But there was no time. Either Civic got them out of there now, or he stayed and tried to help the other man, and probably kill all three of them in the process. He could only be so much of a hero. Civic squeezed the trigger of the fighter's guns and the doors blew outward, revealing the safe embrace of empty space beyond. He breathed deep. He hadn't flown in 2 years, not since... Don't think about it. He kicked in the accelerator. 2 Gs thrust him back in his seat, and his vision went momentarily dark as his body struggled to keep up. The broken bay doors sailed past, and he shot out into space. 2 seconds later, Watchdog Station exploded. Chapter 12. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Ido. Bridge, ISS Independence. "Coming up on the mutinous ships, Admiral," said Lieutenant Whitehorse, though there was no need to say it. Everyone felt it. They felt the distance between them and the alien ship shrink with every passing second. The calm, cool, rational part of Proctor's brain wondered at the science behind it. How amazing it was that whatever field the Golgothics were broadcasting, it was somehow perfectly tuned to be able to influence their actual brain chemistry. The cavewoman part of her brain, strengthening by the second, could only say, "Run, fight, have sex, beat the shit out of that ship, punch Yarborough, rub Mumford's beefy shoulders, no, run." She shook her head and tried to think through the oncoming rush of confusing thoughts and emotions. "Steady, people. Use your brains. You know what is rational and what is crazy." Her jaw was clenched so hard her teeth hurt. This was going to be some battle. If they were fighting themselves, and the mutinous ship, and the alien vessel, things would get interesting and deadly very quickly. "In weapons range, Admiral," said Whitehorse. "Are the mutinous ships in between us and the alien? Perfectly aligned?" "Yes, ma'am." Proctor nodded, as calmly as possible. Was this rational? Was using the ships as cover the right thing to do? The moral, ethical thing to do? The cloud was too thick to rationalize either way. The only course she had was action. "Fire. Ballsy, stand by to deploy fighters." The Independence and the rest of the fleet accompanying it opened up with a barrage of mag-rail fire and pulsed laser beams that, under normal circumstances and against a normal enemy, would have torn any ship to shreds within seconds. The mag-rail slugs and beams shot past the mutinous IDF ships and slammed into the alien ship, which had slowed down and seemed to be holding over Ido.
Any effect?
Whitehorse shook her head, far more quickly than was probably normal for her.
No, ma'am.
She whirled to one of her mag-rail crew officers.
You're out of sync. Get it together, Ensign.
She slammed her fist down on the tactical console. The ensign swore under his breath, but to his credit, kept it together and relayed instructions to his gun crew. They were all going to lose it soon if they didn't either win or get the hell out of there.
Maybe we can weaken one spot if we concentrate our fire.
She brought up a schematic of the Golgothic ship.
All ships, concentrate fire on...
She tapped on a random location on the ship's hull.
These coordinates.
The computer automatically broadcast them to the tactical station and the rest of the fleet.
Ballsy, deploy fighters. All ships deploy fighters and engage that location on the ship.
She held her breath, waiting for the concentrated barrage of mag-rail slugs to finally break through. Dozens of fighters from the Independence and her fleet swarmed out, targeting the chosen location on the alien ship. Nothing. Every slug, every round from every fighter, all just bounced off. Every single one.
Impossible,
she breathed. The primordial rage and terror boiling under the surface was starting to surge up.
Admiral, the Davenport is firing on us,
yelled Whitehorse. The deck shook, claxons rang out.
Captain Shi, cease fire immediately or your vessel will be destroyed,
she said as calmly and yet urgently as possible. Commander Yarbrough called out from the XO station.
Damage on decks 7 and 8, forward sections, evacuating section 1.
The barrage from the Davenport continued, while the Independence and her fleet continued pounding the alien ship to no avail.
Damn it. Fine. Alter targeting to the... Admiral, the Golgothics are firing. Reading energy levels completely off our normal scales.
Lieutenant Whitehorse's hands were a blur on her tactical console. On the view screen, past the mutinous IDF ship, the stationary alien vessel had initiated some sort of pure energy beam. Shimmering purple-white, it lanced out, not at any ship, but towards the moon below. It bored down through Ido's surface, digging deep into its crust. Debris, dust, and explosions blasted out from the drilling zone in a hellish maelstrom.
What the hell?
Proctor leaned forward.
What is it doing?
Commander Mumford shook his head. The beam is an ultra-high-energy composite mix of anti-gallium, boron ions, gamma, X, and ultraviolet rays, along with pure anti-proton ions. Adjusting sensor scales now. He looked up at her, his face draining of color. One hit from that beam and any ship is a goner. Instantly. I'm reading billions of terawatts coming off that thing. The deck shook again. The Davenport was still firing on them, and now a few of the other mutinous ships had joined in, shooting mag-rail slugs at her own fleet. Reyna Scott's voice boomed over the comm.
Shelby, can we tone it down some? Those bastards are hurting my engines. Sorry, Reyna, we're in the thick of it. How are we holding up?
Reyna grunted.
I'll keep her together. But one more well-placed railgun slug, and the core starts getting fussy. Reyna out.
Proctor nodded.
Target the Davenport's weapons systems. Fire.
The deck pulsed with the regular thumps of mag-rail fire, and the Davenport's surface was peppered with tiny explosions as the slugs tore into the hull.
The alien ship is opening fire with their railguns again, said Whitehorse. Their drilling beam is still on, but aimed at the planet. So they can walk and chew gum at the same time, murmured Proctor. Who's getting hit? Mainly the Davenport. A few of the other mutinous ships, one of our ships too. It's basically targeting every ship it has a clear shot at. So our shield is working, she said. God help us. What's the status of the Davenport? Are they still firing on us? No, ma'am. Their laser turrets are dead. Magro tubes destroyed. Reading power fluctuations all over the ship. I think it's going to...
Lieutenant Whitehorse didn't even get to finish her sentence. The Davenport erupted in a blinding explosion as its core went critical. Chapter 13. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Ido. Bridge, ISS Independence. When the glow diminished, the expanding cloud of molten slag that had been the ISS Davenport dissipated enough that Proctor could see through to the other side, where the alien ship still drilled into the little moon. Ido now sported a hole the size of the Independence on its surface, and the purple-white beam continued to plunge into it.
"Sir, something's happening," said Whitehorse. "Detecting movement on the ship. A port is opening."
Proctor snapped around to the tactical station.
"Scan it. All bands. We need to see inside that thing or we'll never know how to beat it." "Scanning."
Whitehorse bit her lip.
"The opening is still covered by some kind of dampening field, similar to our atmospheric containment fields, except this one is blocking all EM bands." "Neutron scan, then."
Whitehorse shook her head.
"Same."
Proctor did a double take.
"They have an EM field that's blocking a neutron scanning beam?"
She glanced over at Commander Mumford.
"How?"
The scientist shrugged. "Unknown, Admiral. Apparently their technology far exceeds our own," he deadpanned. Proctor's eyes stayed locked on the view screen image of the Golgothic ship drilling into Ido.
"Commander, you win the Understatement of the Year award."
She scratched her chin.
"No change in its offensive stance?" "No, Admiral. The other mutinous ships have finally all withdrawn to a distance that appears acceptable to the alien ship. At least it's not firing on them. Or us." "But what the hell is it doing, then?"
As if in answer, something shot out of the port that had opened on the ship. Too fast for Proctor's eyes to track, she glanced at her command console.
"The blazes was that?" "A small tungsten sphere, contents unknown. It's heading straight down into the hole on the planet."
Whitehorse glanced up at Proctor.
"Shall we fire, Admiral?" "Negative. As long as the ship is not attacking us, we just watch."
She noticed Commander Yarbrough eye her with surprise.
"For now,"
she added. On the view screen, they all watched the sphere arc down towards the surface of the moon. The purple-white beam shimmered briefly, pulsating in its last gasps, then disappeared right as the sphere entered the hole that had opened up on Ido's surface. The entire bridge waited with bated breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion or moonquake, energy spike, or whatever massive destruction the alien device would cause on the small moon. Nothing happened.
"Lieutenant?"
Proctor said to Whitehorse.
"Anything." "Sensors are quiet, sir." "So what the hell did that thing do?"
Whitehorse shrugged.
"Nothing on any bands. Just faint tremors. But that looks normal, considering the bastard just drilled a hole down to the moon's core. I can scan using—"
Yarbrough interrupted them.
"Look!"
The ship was moving. Away from the Independence. Away from the small, battered, mutinous IDF fleet huddled in the background. And moments later, with the telltale flicker of a Q-jump, it disappeared. Instantly, the intense, overflowing surge of emotions dissipated. Her heartbeat slowed to something normal. Everyone on the bridge breathed a little calmer. Lieutenant Qwerty called over from the comm station. "Receiving messages from the captains of the mutinous ships, Admiral. They're, apologizing. Profusely and all sincere-like."
"Well,"
began Proctor, swiveling around to face her bridge crew. Her eyes drifted over the spot on the deck where Captain Prucha's blood still stained it, then back up to the view screen which still displayed the tiny moon Ido.
"This certainly qualifies as the oddest alien invasion I've ever seen. Still no changes from the moon?" "No, ma'am."
Whitehorse's brow furrowed.
"Unless you consider a 0.00001% increase in its mass to be a significant change."
Chapter 14. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. High orbit. When Civic woke up, His first thought was to wonder at which point he'd passed out and why. Must have been the sustained high G thrust. Or maybe they'd run into something on their way out of the station and he'd hit his head. Or maybe the expanding apocalyptic sphere of the exploding station had caught up with them. Whatever it was, something was tugging persistently on his arm, and distantly he could hear a similarly persistent voice. A woman. She was pulling at him, and yelling something, which of course he couldn't quite make out since they both had their helmets on. But he didn't need to hear her to understand what she was saying, since with her other hand she was frantically pointing up through the cockpit. He looked up. Oh, shit. Bolivar loomed up above them, or below them since they were technically falling. Falling very quickly, judging by the orange shock wave of compressed atmosphere taking shape between them and the planet. He grabbed the controls and pushed on the accelerator. It was dead. Oh, hell no, he said, punching buttons on his console in a vain attempt to restart the engines. But they were dead. Cold out. The distant voice suddenly magnified 1,000-fold. The reaction chamber is fine. I think it's the plasma conduits. He nearly jumped out of his seat, hearing the bullhorn sound in his ears. She must have figured out what comm channel his helmet was on. What? How do you know? He still fumbled with the controls, his hands trembling now that the cockpit was shaking from the re-entry. He wasn't sure if they were trembling from fear or momentum transfer. We hit something a few minutes ago. I think it cut through the main plasma line, and the auxiliaries are notoriously unreliable on these birds. She sounded oddly confident in her diagnosis and assessment of the little ship's idiosyncrasies. Mechanic? He said. Yeah. She was breathing heavily, rapidly. Unless she slowed down, she was going to hyperventilate. Not that the imminent fiery death coming for them wouldn't quickly solve her breathing problems. I'm Ethan. What's your name? She gulped and panted into her helmet's microphone. The shuttle shook even harder. Sarah. Look, Sarah, we can pull out of this, but I need your help. Can you fix it? I think so. I don't know. If I were down underneath the fighter and had all my tools, maybe. Not the main plasma line. I mean the auxiliaries. You sound like you know all about them. Can you get them working? We have access to them right there in the back of the cockpit. She nodded. Oh, yeah, I should have known that. Sorry. It was obvious that she was in shock. Her hands trembled, and her eyes kept darting around the cockpit, up through the transparent cockpit windows overhead toward the glowing shock wave and the icy blue planet beyond. Look, Sarah, we're going to pull through this. Just get back there and work your magic with those auxiliaries. She nodded vigorously again. Her restraints fell away and she squirmed her way back into the rear of the cockpit, and he could hear the access panel fall away. Okay, I see the auxiliary lines. Backed up, just like I thought. Can you unback them? If I had my tools... The roar from re-entry was getting loud enough to hear through the helmet, and almost loud enough to make it difficult to hear her voice. Look, Sarah, we don't have time. We're dead in 20 seconds unless you can do something, anything. Her breathing grew calm. Finally, she said, Well, here goes nothing. She started pounding on the plasma line with her fist. What are you doing? He started to hyperventilate a little himself. Being persuasive, she grunted in between blows. Oh my God, we're going to die. She pounded harder. He tried to breathe regularly. Are you sure that's going to do anything? It only works in the movies. But the shuddering whine of the engine cut him off, and she laughed triumphantly. Holy shit, it actually worked. Hold on to something. He pushed the accelerator to maximum, as high as it could go while running off auxiliaries, which was still capable of producing a dangerous amount of thrust if one was not properly secured. She grunted as the fighter started to swivel. Civic managed to get the belly of the craft aimed at the planet, and then point the nose slowly toward the horizon, and then above it. The roar from the engines overtook the roar of re-entry, and the plasma lines began to whine in protest. Those things going to hold? He risked a glance back at her. Yeah. If they don't, I'll beat the shit out of them again, she said. I think I like this one. Okay, here we go. Things are about to get really rough. Rougher?
Touché. The accelerator depressed to maximum, and 3 Gs of relentless force thrust him back into his seat. He heard her swear up a storm as she was mashed against the rear of the cockpit, and he prayed she managed to keep her limbs from falling down into the access plate, or her bones would snap in an instant. 10 seconds later, it was over. The red compression wave dissipated, and his instruments informed him that they had achieved a stable orbit. "Well," he began, "that's a supposedly fun thing that I'll never do again." "You call that fun?" She pulled herself up to a sitting position from where she'd fallen after the thrust had cut out. "If it means we get to live at the end, then yes." He looked all around the fighter at the area of space they were in. Bolivar appeared peaceful and blue below them, in contrast to the still expanding, glowing wreckage of the former Watchdog station. There was nothing salvageable. The reactor going critical was enough to heat every remaining particle of the slag cloud up past a few thousand degrees, and even through the thick composite glass of the cockpit windows, he could feel the radiated heat from the debris. It was like a small, diffuse sun. The woman, Sarah, stared transfixed out the window, up at the glowing wreckage cloud. "I knew people there. It was my home." She murmured the words in a flat, monotone voice, as if still in shock and not believing what she was seeing. "They're all dead, aren't they? No one else made it out but us." He frowned, his last memories of the escape from the station flooding back to him. "Oh, we weren't the only ones. There were 2 others, 2 IDF guys like me." He glanced back at her uniform. "Contractor, right?" "Yeah, Shovik Orion." He nodded. That was the main commercial supplier of equipment to the station, especially the high-grade military stuff. The fighters, some of the station's armaments. The massive multi-world conglomerate had a few competitors: Hao Wang Enterprises, Luminaris Corp., Blue Sky Development, but none of them were quite the one-stop shop like Shovik Orion. That man, the one killed execution style by the murderers. "Did you know a guy, another contractor there at the station who was..." He tried to remember the man. Luckily, the adrenaline rushing through his brain at the time had etched every detail into memory like dynamite-proof stone. Short, balding, a little goatee, talked like he was from Britannia. "Jerry Underwood. Yeah, did you know him? Was he..." She paused, glancing up at the glowing slag set against the peaceful backdrop of stars. "He's dead, yes." He wondered how much he should tell her. What he'd seen had the hallmarks of organized crime, or a large political military-industrial conspiracy, or something. Did he want to draw her into that? Did he want to get drawn into that? He followed her gaze up to the expanding cloud. Damn, he was already drawn into it. Both of them. He was shot. Civic turned to her, watching the horror begin to spread over her face. The 2 IDF guys I was talking about. They shot him point blank, right in the forehead, just a few minutes before I picked you up. "Jerry?" she began. "No. Why would someone do that? Are you sure you saw what you..." "I'm sure. Look, Sarah." He paused, waiting for her last name. "Batak." "Look, Sarah Batak. I'm Ethan Civic. IDF's in my blood. My mom was a fighter pilot before she died. Fought in the Second Swarm War. My dad, too. He's a big shot IDF guy now, and knows lots of people high up. I think we need to go find him. I don't know who we can trust right now. After seeing those 2 officers blow away Underwood, they might be expecting to be the only survivors of that place, and wouldn't take kindly to, witnesses." Her face hardened. "You don't suppose there are more of them in IDF? Do you think they were lone wolves, or is this something bigger?" He shrugged. "Well, with Sangre de Cristo a few weeks ago, and the GPC insurgency? This could all be a part of that. And if they found out that there were witnesses to whatever it was I witnessed, well, Let's just say I think we should keep a low profile until we can figure out who we can trust.
You don't think we should go down to CENTCOM, Bolivar, and report in?
He shook his head. I don't. I think we should go find my dad. Like I said, he's well connected. Really high up at IDF, like probably an admiral by now, and I trust him. She eyed him with what he guessed was mild suspicion.
Probably. An admiral. Trust him. You don't sound terribly convinced.
That's because I'm not, he wanted to say. But that would be silly. Just because he had a bad relationship with his pops didn't mean the guy couldn't be trusted. Bad relationship wasn't quite the right term. Non-existent would be better, though that would imply they hadn't had enough contact for the old jackass to disapprove of his son's career choices, and general lack of turning out just like him. Nah, he's okay. He's an old war hero, and everyone trusts him. We need to find him, and tell him what happened. He'll know what to do with it. After seeing Underwood get blown away by two guys in IDF uniforms, I'm not sure I trust anyone in an IDF uniform right now. She was still in too much shock to argue.
You think he'll know what to do?
He nodded and pressed on the accelerator, aiming for one of the civilian rescue ships that had deployed into orbit, hard at work, responding to the hundreds of civilian vessels that had been affected by the mysterious alien ship and the subsequent blast of Watchdog Station. He always knows what to do, especially when it's someone else's problems, like mine. Chapter 15. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Ido. Bridge, ISS Independence. Flashes of the Second Swarm War erupted into Proctor's memory. All those artificial singularity devices the swarm carriers launched at Earth and dozens of other United Earth planets devastated cities and killed hundreds of millions. 4 months of horror, sacrifice, and unthinkable numbers of dead. And through it all, the fear that at any moment a swarm fleet would appear suddenly over the next UE world, launching dozens of singularities towards the surface, sucking billions of tons of matter in, then blasting outward, consuming entire cities in seconds. Even the most destructive thermonuclear weapon humanity had ever tested couldn't hold a candle to a single swarm singularity device. Which meant it was time to leave. Whatever was increasing the mass of Ido was... Well, whatever it was suspiciously and dangerously like what the swarm had thrown at them before.
The swarm is dead, isn't it? I killed the last ship myself.
Get us out of here, now! Signal a general retreat. Everyone regroups at Bolivar. Whitehorse looked up at the screen suddenly, as if expecting to see a new, deadly threat.
Ma'am?
Commander Yarbrough, who'd remained mostly silent throughout the engagement, ever since the gruesome death of Captain Prucha, took a few steps to the center of the bridge.
What now? Is the mass still increasing?
Proctor asked without acknowledging the question. Whitehorse nodded.
Another 0.00001% increase.
Could the sensors be miscalibrated? Yarbrough asked.
We did sustain heavy damage. There might be a trickle power buildup along the sensor array that could explain the readings.
Proctor shook her head and stood up, jabbing a finger towards the moon on the screen.
No. It did something to Ido. The moon's going to blow, and I want to be as far away as possible from it when it does. Ensign Risa, now, please, take us back to Bolivar.
She punched the comm button on her armrest.
Ballsy, are the fighters in?
But how do you know that, Admiral? Continued Yarbrough, before Vols could respond from the fighter deck.
There's no indication whatsoever that Ido is going to explode. Is this just a hunch?
She shot him through with a withering glance, full of annoyance.
Yes, Commander, it's called a friggin' hunch. You know how many battles I lived through 30 years ago? How many times Captain Granger and I had to rely on our hunches to get us through to another day? 23. 25 if you count that first battle for Earth as 3 separate battles, which it sure as hell felt like. And I saw enough of those artificial singularity bombs to know that any time you see something's mass increase, especially in an inexplicable way, like we see down there, then you get the hell out, fast. Vals's voice pierced through the conversation. "Yeah, Shelby, we got everyone." Proctor glanced one more time, sidelong at Yarbrough. "We done?" From his frustrated expression, it was clear he wasn't, but he gave a quick, exasperated nod. He apparently dealt with stress by fretting over numbers and specifics, but anal retention was not going to win them a war. "Ensign, now please," said Proctor. "Course, ma'am." "Back to Bolivar. At least there we can watch and see whatever the hell is going to happen to this moon." Ido continued rotating slowly beneath them, and then it was gone as they T-jumped away, replaced by a starfield, until the camera shifted toward Bolivar, and the wreckage of the IDF station that had just been slagged in orbit. Proctor let out a long, slow breath. Safe for now. "Now the damned thing's probably moved on to another system." Ensign Risa, young as she was, breathed deeply now that the immediate danger had passed, looking around the bridge erratically. She fixated on the stained ring of blood on the deck where Captain Prucha had fallen. "What do they want?" she murmured. Proctor stared at the ring of blood along with her. "I don't know. But if it's the swarm, or anything similar to the swarm, then the answer is clear. They want us dead." Chapter 16. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. High Orbit. The intra-system comm traffic was a mess, with literally hundreds of ships disabled or underpowered from the havoc caused by both the mystery ship, the ensuing battle, and the explosion of Watchdog Station. And Civic had a hell of a time getting through to the civilian rescue vessel Miguel S. Urquiza, a massive old colonial transport ship with a dozen cargo bays, meant for moving large amounts of goods to sustain new colonies that hadn't reached self-sufficiency yet. "That's what I'm telling you, ma'am. Our initial motivators are out, and we need to dock with you folks, since we'll never be able to make it down to the surface." The traffic coordinator on the colonial ship interrupted. "I understand that, sir, but what I'm telling you is that space here is at a premium right now on the Urquiza, and that all military ships unable to reach the surface are advised to wait for the Bolivaran Defense Fleet to return or hitch a ride on one of the other IDF ships in the vicinity." She sounded snippy and curt, and Civic imagined a boring administrator in a drab gray business suit in a drab gray bureaucratic office with drab gray furniture and ugly bare walls. "Look, Mrs. Chalmers, Miss Chalmers. Look, Miss Chalmers. We're not going to make it over here. Besides the motivator being out," he glanced at Patak with a questioning look, but she only shrugged. "Besides the motivator, ma'am, our life support is on the fritz. I'm not entirely convinced we're going to make it here." She sounded like a comm broadcast on auto-repeat. "I understand that, sir. But what I'm telling you is that space is at a premium and strictly reserved for damaged civilian craft, of which we have quite a backlog, some in worse condition than you. You'll just have to hold on until—" He rolled his eyes toward Patak, who rolled hers in return. She shared his disgust, apparently. And then it hit him. He'd been staring at the answer without realizing it. "Miss Chalmers, I neglected to mention that my shipmate here is a civilian, a contractor that was working at Watchdog Station. Surely that qualifies us to land?" A pause. The traffic coordinator's voice stayed the same, neutral and bland. "Landing approved. Stand by for approach vector and landing coordinates." "Thank you," he said, with a tad more sarcasm than he intended, and flipped the comm off. Batak rolled her eyes again. "All I could imagine was some drab grey business suit lady in some drab grey office with boring inspirational posters on the wall." In spite of the shock of what they'd just gone through, he grinned. They were clearly on the same wavelength. "Marry me?" She shook her head and held up a wagging finger. "Sorry, I only marry boring assholes, and then I divorce their asses when they don't buy me shit." "Sounds like you've had a fun life." He eyed her again. She couldn't be older than 25, tops. "Married? Already?" "Twice. Divorced twice. Yeah, I know how to pick 'em." She shifted around on the floor behind the seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. "In all fairness, the second divorce was 25% my fault.
Oh? He pushed the fighter's controls along the approach vector that the civilian transport beamed to him. Well, I figure I was 50% responsible for the wedding and 0% responsible for the divorce, so that comes out to an even 25. I'm not sure that math works out. She sighed in mock exasperation. It never does. The fighter settled into its approach vector, and Civic switched it over to autopilot, letting the computer coordinate the details with the transport's computers. In spite of their light-hearted conversation, all he could think about was that poor contractor, Jerry Underwood. His body tumbling gently in the zero-G, blood streaming out of his forehead, forming a spiral as the corpse rotated. He knew he'd have nightmares about it the rest of his life. Look, we've got to figure this out. Until I know what's going on, I don't know who we can trust. He pulled up the computer and linked to the civilian network through the data connection with the transport. Do you know what Jerry was working on? She shook her head. He was one of the supervisors. I was just a grunt working on the shuttle bay deck. He began. I can't even find my pops. His location is classified. Hold on, let me switch over to the military network. She kept shaking her head intermittently. Damn, she was still in shock. I just can't imagine why anyone would want to kill Jerry. He was such a nice guy. Never snapped at me, was always helpful, cheery, smiling. She finally looked up at him. Why? Who would do this? Bad guys? He connected to the network and repeated the search. Okay. Looks like Dad's location is even classified on the military network, which means it's actually classified and not just protected info. He must be up to something big. You said his killers were wearing IDF uniforms? She asked. Yep. That doesn't necessarily mean they were IDF. He paused, considering. But it probably does. No idea. Let's just get over there, collect ourselves, maybe grab a drink, and then huddle. Huddle? Yeah, an old football term, something I did a lot. Old Pops loved making me play football. You don't like your dad, do you? Was it that obvious? The fighter sailed past the shuttle bay doors on the transport. Okay, here we go. Prepare for landing. Might bump a little. It did bump a little, but she looked like she weathered it okay. Once the fighter's engines were powered down, he finally realized that his entire body had been tense, so he focused on relaxing. No sense in passing out once he jumped down from the hatch. He hit the deck and reached up to help Batak down. There you go, watch your head there. That's it. She landed with a grunt. She might be injured, so he made a mental note to get her to the transport's sickbay. In fact, she looked dazed. She'd probably need help checking in with the deck staff on duty. He turned to lead them to processing and immediately stopped in his tracks. 2 security officers blocked his path. One of the men unholstered a gun, while the other brandished handcuffs. He heard Batak mumble under her breath, "It don't rain, but it shitstorms." The man with the gun eyed him warily. "Lieutenant Ethan Civic, you're under arrest. Please come with us immediately." Chapter 17. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Bridge, ISS Independence. Damn. She'd been out of IDF for too long. Out of leadership and away from the requirements of being a leader. Away from the spotlight. Away from the need to inspire one's people and to present a steady hand and firm guidance in the face of danger. Her people needed her. And she needed them. She needed them to be their best, and they wouldn't be their best if they thought she was some old baddie woman about to lose it. She rose slowly, confidently out of her chair and turned to face her bridge crew before unleashing a rapid-fire list of orders. Like riding a bicycle, she thought with an inward grin. Commence orbital scan. Look for survivors and dispatch shuttles to bring them in. Lieutenant Querty, give me the local IDF brass down on Bolivar. I need to know who was giving orders to the Bolivaran Defense Fleet, and if they were somehow connected to the mutiny. Commander Yarbrough, get the damn ship fixed. Stat! All crews are to be assigned to repair and recovery duties until further notice. with emphasis on repair. I want to be ready if that turd waffle of a ship comes back. Ballsy?" She rose her head to the comm microphones, listening in. "I think you know what to do, Captain. I want you analyzing that ship, everything we've got on it, and hunker down with your boys and girls and figure out some combat strategy against that thing." "You got it, ma'am," Ballsy said through the speakers. She continued rattling off a list of commands, and she was heartened to see her crew spring into action as she gave them direction. None of these people had seen battle. None. Half of them weren't even born yet when Earth and its colonies had nearly been wiped out. She supposed she and Ballsy were the only ones who had been around during the Second Swarm War 30 years ago. Well, them and Captain Prucha, for all the good it had done him. Damn it, Prucha. You left me with a boat full of kids. They had better be more mature than her classes full of snot-nosed preteens in post-teen bodies. "Ma'am?" began Lieutenant QWERTY, a single word drawn out into 2 syllables. "Got Admiral Mullins on the line for you. He's the ranking IDF officer at CENTCOM Bolivar." "Thank you, Lieutenant. Patch it through to the ready room," she said, retreating to a door off to the side of the bridge. She'd only spent a few minutes in there since stepping foot on the ship. She hadn't even packed any of her belongings to decorate the walls or desk, so the space was rather stark and bare. Not that she was the sentimental type for knickknacks and odds and ends that just got in the way, but still. She supposed it was something a normal ship captain would do. Hell, she hadn't even had time to bring a picture of her brother's family to hang on her wall. She considered them her own family, and had essentially adopted her brother's kids, even though he'd been happily married for decades. She could have at least brought a picture of them. The thought reminded her of her main reason for being out here, at least the main unofficial reason. "Danny," she murmured to herself, "where the hell have you gotten yourself to?" She sat down at the desk and waved the video comm on. "Admiral Mullins!" A heavy-set, middle-aged man flashed onto the screen. His gray mustache rested on his upper lip like a dead snail, his brow furrowed and wrinkled like a man who'd lost a lot of sleep.
"Admiral Proctor, I see they've dragged you out of retirement, which I suppose means that IDF thinks we're fucked."
"Language, Admiral."
The other man snorted a quick chuckle, but became serious within seconds.
"Proctor, you engaged the ship. Notice anything odd about your crew when you did? About yourself?"
She nodded.
"We're analyzing that now. Must be some sort of high-level EM interference with a modulation that was somehow able to couple with with our brains."
She shrugged, acknowledging the improbability of it all. And yet she'd felt it. They'd all felt it.
"Is that even possible?"
"We have several hundred witnesses up here that say it's possible, Admiral. And you've half a planetary defense fleet that went rogue on me. I think that speaks for itself."
He nodded, and his mustache bristled as he frowned.
"We've got about 20 million people down here that can back them up. Proctor, ever since that ship entered orbit a few hours ago, we've had massive social unrest. Riots, violence, arson, on a planet-wide scale. It's like something just exploded in the minds of everyone down here all at the same time. Even I was feeling it. Nearly bit the head off my chief of staff."
"Is everyone okay? Looks like the effect is highly localized."
Admiral Mullins looked off camera as if to receive a report and nodded curtly at whoever was speaking to him. He turned back to Proctor.
"A few thousand deaths across the planet. All told, it's remarkable that's all there were. And yes, I can confirm that the effect was localized. The areas most intensely affected were directly under the orbital path of the ship. But, Shelby, riots happened everywhere. Bolivar isn't the most stable planet, politically, I mean."
She frowned.
"What do you mean?"
"Bolivar is a hotbed for GPC activity. Half of the Bolivaran Planetary Senate are GPC loyalists. And to be honest..."
He looked to his left as if to check who was in the room with him.
"I think half the ship captains of the Planetary Defense Fleet are too."
Well, that made sense, she thought wryly. Information that would have been far more helpful an hour earlier.
"GPC loyalists and IDF. Are you sure?
Well, no, I'm not sure. But there have been rumblings, whispers. Not exactly of an uprising or mutiny or anything like that, but rumors. Messages I've seen that the senders weren't planning on me seeing seem to suggest that there's widespread discontent with UE's central authority, even among some of the IDF officers at CENTCOM Bolivar.
That was troubling. Why had Oppenheimer not told her anything about that? She'd remembered 10 years ago that there were rumblings in the lower officer corps about the GPC, but nothing in the open. Especially not among her top admiralty and ship captains.
Do you think there's a deeper problem here? Or is it really just grumbling?
Mullins shrugged.
A few weeks ago, I'd have said it was nothing. But ever since Sangre...
The situation's inflamed, she finished for him.
That's being generous. Sangre blew the lid off the pot. It changed everything. Where before we had simmering tensions between GPC separatists and UE loyalists, well, now we've got... Well, not open fighting, but tension is too naive. 9 officers have been found dead in the last week, either in their quarters or some back alley in the city, or on some hiking trail out in the suburbs. Violence against both sides is skyrocketing. This world is a powder keg, Admiral, along with half a dozen other worlds in the Irigoyen sector if my sources are right.
San Martin?
He nodded.
That's basically the epicenter of the GPC organization. Bolivar is probably the second biggest, but the GPC's Secretary General lives on San Martin, they say, and have his shadow cabinet.
Curiel. I'd heard he was dead, assassinated by his own bodyguards.
Mullins chuckled.
Rumor. Probably spread by Curiel himself to confuse IDF intel. But my source swears she saw him 2 weeks ago, alive and well.
Proctor shook her head. She didn't have time for this. She wasn't a politician, and she wasn't an intelligence official. She just wanted to save her civilization from an existential alien threat, and hopefully find her nephew in the process. She didn't have time for humans being humans.
Admiral, while this is all very interesting, I think I'm the wrong person to be talking to. You need the chief of IDF Intel out here. Get your heads together. But as for me, the Independence is out of here as soon as repairs are done, and I've completed a little mission of a personal nature planet-side.
Oh?
His eyebrows rose, questioning.
My nephew. I think he's got a few friends down there I want to question. The thing is, he's missing.
He nodded, almost as if he'd been expecting her to say it.
I know.
Her eyes narrowed.
How do you know?
Because you know that source that told me she saw Secretary General?
He held up 2 sets of fingers as air quotes.
Curiel 2 weeks ago? Well, my source happens to be Danny Proctor's girlfriend. I'm sorry, Shelby, but it looks like your nephew is a GPC pilot.
She opened her mouth and closed it again, grasping at something to say.
Fuck,
was all she could settle on.
Watch your language, Shelby,
he deadpanned. Chapter 18. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Rescue Ship Miguel S. Urquiza, High Orbit. Civic's mind was racing. Staring down the barrel of a gun tended to have that effect. And you are? He flashed a wide smile. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Bolivaran Intelligence Service, one of them said, pulling his badge out and flashing it too quickly to see. We've been monitoring your movements and communications, he added, as if that answered everything, as if that automatically made Civic guilty of whatever they were implying. You'll come with us now, sir. They advanced toward him, slowly. Civic realized his hands were already in the air, automatically. It's amazing what one's body automatically does in response to threat, he thought. Wait a minute. Bolivaran Intelligence Service, what the hell is that? To his surprise, someone moved in front of him, stopping their advance. It was Batak. Her arms were folded and her face said, "Don't mess with me."
Bullshit,
she said.
I know you. I've seen you around the offices and warehouses, even up on station. You're Shovik Orion. Security, right?
The man with the gun looked taken aback, but quickly regained his footing.
Switched jobs a few months back. Come on, let's go.
He motioned with the gun towards one of the exits. Several people nearby had noticed the standoff and were rushing away, making the man with the gun glance at them with what was clearly apprehension. They clearly did not want to be seen. Thankfully, the deck officer of the transport approached.
Is there a problem here?
He said angrily, as angrily as he dared to be with someone holding a gun.
Gentlemen, may I see your badges?
While they were fumbling for their IDs, Civic glanced around the giant cargo bay, which had obviously been refitted in a hurry to serve as a shuttle hold for a rescue operation. Frightened people were stumbling out of their ships, merchant freighters, pleasure yachts, tourist corvettes, orbital transfer shuttles, and moving quickly towards the exits, ushered by flight deck staff to make room for the steady stream of newly arriving ships. One particular shuttle stood out to him. Holy shit. It was the shuttle from the Watchdog station. Fenway. The one the two murderers had escaped in. It was unmistakable. The deck officer looked up from the IDs the intel officers had handed him.
Everything looks to be in order. Mr. Civic, I suggest you cooperate. Don't give us any shit. Not on my deck.
He took a few steps back, and seeing another commotion from the passengers of another merchant freighter, he left. The man with the gun smiled.
So, Lieutenant Civic, do we do this the easy way or the hard way? I'd greatly prefer the easy way. I don't want to see anyone else here get hurt. You're already responsible for enough death today.
Civic's eyes darted to the shuttle again and back to the gun, his mind racing furiously. Obviously, something was up. Not just something, this was conspiracy theory level shit here. The two men on board the Watchdog in IDF uniforms. These two guys in the uniforms of what was probably a completely fabricated organization. Batak claiming that at least one of them was a Shovik Orion employee. The deck officer taking their side, though he supposed in his shoes, seeing the gun and not wanting a gunfight to erupt in the middle of a desperate rescue operation, Civic would probably do the same. And the shuttle. Fenway. His hands were still up, and he nodded.
The easy way, if you don't mind. Sarah, if you'll excuse me, no, her too. She'll be investigated as an accomplice, said the man with the handcuffs.
Civic allowed them to cuff him. They shoved him ahead, and Batak followed closely behind, with the two men bringing up the rear, corralling them towards one of the exits. Luckily, that exit lay just beyond the shuttle Fenway. As they passed it, he rammed into Batak with his shoulder, pushing both of them around the corner of the shuttle.
Open it and get in, fast!
She was quick on the draw, he'd give her that. Without waiting even half a second, she'd punched the hatch controls. It was going to take at least 5 seconds for the hatch to open completely, so he needed to do something incredibly stupid to stall for time. The gun, and the hands holding it, appeared around the corner of the shuttle, and Civic did his best imitation of a karate kick. To his complete surprise, the gun went flying. Holy shit! That only happens in the movies. But he didn't have time to pat himself on the back. The man who'd been holding the gun dashed for it as it slid away on the deck, and the other leaped to tackle Civic. They both went down in a tangle of thrashing arms and legs. He heard a solid thud, and his opponent went limp. Batak grabbed his arm, yanking him up the ramp just as gunshots rang out, hitting the hatch next to his head in a hail of sparks. He dove in and rolled out of the way of the entrance as the door started to close. Apparently, Batak had managed to hit the controls again. More gunfire, striking the opposite wall from the closing ramp, and then hitting the backside of the ramp itself as it sealed shut. He finally risked a glance back up at Batak, who stood there trembling, still holding the plasma welding torch he must have used on the other man's head. "You keep that in your pocket?" he said with a lopsided smile. "Damn, Civic. Now's not the time for flirting." She began. She was trembling even more now. He stood up, which was decidedly more difficult with handcuffs on than without. "Hatch locked?" She nodded vigorously, eyes wide. He saw that her fingers were gripping the plasma welder so tight that her knuckles were white. He turned around and presented his handcuffed wrists to her. "Will that work on these?" "Yeah," she said. snapping into the moment as she brought the torch to bear on his wrists. "Don't cut my hands off, please. They're actually my best The cuffs dropped onto the floor. Damn, she was good. "Wow, I hardly felt what you were doing." He rubbed his wrists. "That's what she said." He did a double take. She still looked half in shock, but the comment, combined with the slight wink, told him she'd be just fine. Maybe. Her hands were still trembling. Freed from the cuffs, he ran for the navigation station cockpit. The shuttle was small, only a cockpit, 3 tiny crew quarters, a mess and a cargo bay, which was little more than a glorified trunk. He'd only flown one a few times before. It was the last thing he flew before he lost his wings. He took a deep breath to ground himself before he slid into the pilot's seat. "You can do this, Civic." "Hold on. We're making what you might call a quick getaway. Strap in." He fired up the engines and skipped the pre-flight checklist. Rather, he grabbed the controls and immediately lifted the shuttle off the deck, soared up high towards the ceiling to avoid hitting any refugees standing nearby, and shot through the shimmering blue field that held the atmosphere in. "What the hell just happened back there?" she said. He steered the shuttle away from the Urquiza and angled up towards the North Pole of Bolivar. He had no idea where they were going, but he figured the fewer people that knew where he was, the better. And there was no better place to hide than over a magnetic pole of a planet, especially one with such a strong magnetic field like Bolivar. It had been wreaking havoc with his regularly scheduled sensor scans aboard the Watchdog ever since he'd started his tour there. Now it was finally working in his favor. "I don't know." "What did you do on the Watchdog? Why are they trying to arrest you?" He shook his head. Jerry Underwood spun helplessly in his mind, flinging blood in a slow spiral. It was like a video on repeat. Spin, spin, blood, spatter, spin. "I don't think it's what I did. I think it's what I saw." Chapter 19. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Shuttle, Bolivar Stratosphere. A GPC pilot. Her little nephew. The one she had bounced on her knees and played with on the beach and changed his diapers while she was stationed on Britannia as the Fleet Admiral of IDF. A pilot. For the goddamned Galactic People's Congress. What the hell did people see in that gang of miscreants? "Damn it, Ballsy! What the hell do people see in that gang of miscreants?" She stared fiercely at the screen on her hand unit. Vols looked back at her, shrugging. She puffed air out in frustration and glanced out the window of the shuttle as the compressed atmosphere glowed red with re-entry. "Freedom's a powerful word, Shelby," he began before she cut him off. "Freedom? How in the world is United Earth not free? How can anyone possibly think that? Are they mistaking us for the Russian Confederation? The Caliphate? The CIDR?" "I'm sure the Chinese would dispute your insinuations, but that's not the point, Shelby." "How is that not the point, Ballsy? Enlighten me." She was agitated, and treating him harsher than she meant. But he took it in stride, seeming to understand that the source of her consternation was not him, or even the GPC thugs, but that little boy she had bounced on her knees. "There are GPC people in all 4 nations, not just UE. They're sick of us. They're sick of the international tensions and disputes. They see themselves as the people." He rolled his eyes as he put air quotes around the people. "People my ass." The shuttle bounced in the upper atmospheric turbulence, and she glanced at the ETA timer on the pilot's dashboard. 5.5 minutes to Shovik Orion City, Bolivar. Shovik Orion City. Idiot corporations and their idiotic naming and branding schemes. Her executive assistant, a young red-haired ensign with a noticeable bump on her lower abdomen, entered the cabin from the tiny galley, offering Proctor a steaming cup of tea. "Thank you, Ensign Flay." Vols continued. "Have you been in a mining colony before, Shelby?" "This isn't the 22nd century anymore, Ballsy. Sure, humans did awful things to each other. Sure, the mining colonies out on Ceres and Vesta, and all the other asteroid belt settlements were scandalous, ugly affairs. But that was 500 years ago. Vols shrugged again.
Uh-huh.
But tell that to people living in mining colonies today. Yeah, they're not necessarily starving or growing up with chronic bone deformities because of the low G. But you ask any iridium miner whether he actually wants to be there, guess what you're going to hear? You ask some farmer out on Cadiz whether they want UE bureaucrats 200 light-years away on Britannia deciding the finer details of harvest equipment certifications. You ask Russian merchants on Serene if they want a distant Russian Confederation government telling them what they should be paying in taxes just because they live on the wrong side of their own city. Then they can leave. They can move on and go farm somewhere else, or sign up for IDF, or go on the dole if they want. Seriously, my taxes are high enough that half of UE could be living like kings if they didn't throw it all away on post-swarm war defense posturing. Ballsy's eyes narrowed. Come on, Shelby, you were the architect of half those programs.
Like hell. It was all President Singh. I was constantly telling him the swarm was gone. I killed the last ship after all. And my Skura contacts assured me that they could detect nothing through their mental metaspace link, the ligature or whatever they call it. The swarm was dead. There was no reason to spend 95% of our friggin' galactic budget on defense if all there was to defend against was each other.
Ballsy fell quiet, looking at her intensely through the comm device on his lap. So then what the hell was that thing out there? That ship? She paused, thinking, considering. It just didn't feel like the swarm. The swarm was relentless, overpowering, almost bloodthirsty. So far, the best descriptor she had for this mysterious ship was erratic.
I don't know.
You think it's the swarm? She slowly shook her head.
No.
Me either. Look, you go find your nephew. I've got my pilots here in the conference room and we're poring over the vids and scans, designing appropriate attack measures and defensive postures. And I've borrowed some of your bridge tactical folks and we're doing the same with them, figuring out how the Independence itself should respond next time. When you face them again, you'll have some options.
She smiled. Thank you, Ballsy. I'm glad you're with me on this one, after seeing Jeremy go out like that.
He nodded. His face was taut, as if he were trying desperately not to feel, not to hurt. Rucha was a good man. Let's make sure no more join him. Vol's out. His face winked out from the comm, and she settled in for the rest of the descent. She prepared herself to meet this woman, this mystery person that Admiral Mullins claimed was Danny's girlfriend. This woman who had apparently been in such a position that she'd not only seen the so-called Secretary General Curiel of the GPC, but also been in a position to report it to Mullins. The hell was she, an intel agent? She supposed she'd soon find out. Mullins had arranged a meeting, and Proctor was on her way to CENTCOM Bolivar in Shovik Orion City to talk to her in a briefing room, and finally get some answers about her nephew. Ensign Flay had strapped in and was on her comm device, coordinating Proctor's security with the Marine office at CENTCOM Bolivar. Eventually, she shut the device down and nodded over at her.
All set, Admiral. Thank you, Ensign Flay.
Her eyes dropped down momentarily to her abdomen.
Congratulations. Oh.
The ensign replied, blushing slightly.
Thank you. 7 months went fast. Maternity leave starts next week, if you were wondering. Sorry, you'll have a disruption in your staff. I'll train my replacement well and make sure it's as painless as...
Proctor held up a reassuring hand.
It's all right, Ensign. Life happens. And besides, this is a short-term assignment for me anyway. I won't even be here next week.
The young ensign looked relieved. Proctor reviewed a few administrative items with her, and before long the ETA timer had ticked its way down to 0. She unstrapped herself from the seat and descended the shuttle's ramp.
I'll be with you shortly, ma'am. I need to hand off the shuttle to the guard,
said Flay from the cockpit. Proctor nodded her approval and continued down to the landing pad where she met an aide to Admiral Mullins, who had come with a Marine honor guard. They indicated toward the entrance to the massive CENTCOM building from the landing pad, where 2 more guards stood at attention. And suddenly the guards were no longer standing. They were flying. Flames gutted windows all around them, and the doors blasted outward in a jarring explosion.
Proctor touched her forehead and her hand came away red. She didn't realize until moments later that she was lying on the ground several meters past the shuttle from where she'd been walking. "Don't pass out. Don't pass out." Chapter 20. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Shuttle Fenway, high orbit. "What do you mean they're following us?" Civic eyed the sensor readout, pointing at the map of the surrounding space in their orbit over Bolivar. Transponder codes and insignia from hundreds of different ships dotted the schematic, but the main one, the biggest one, had changed course, and was headed straight towards them on an intercept course. "That's what I'm saying. The Urquiza is on our tail, and if those two Bolivaran intelligence officers," he made some air quotes with his fingers, "are any indication, there's clearly some people that want us off the board. And they're high up enough to redirect Bolivar's main emergency response ship. That spells trouble if I ever saw it." She shook her head in disbelief. "I just don't get it. So you saw a guy get offed. I mean, that's really bad. Sure, it's murder. But let's face it, the entire station exploded. You'd think the authorities would have bigger fish to fry here." "What's the connection, Civic?" "What?" she said. He hadn't realized he had murmured the question under his breath. "Sorry, just... what's the connection? Two IDF officers blow a guy away on a station that's just been hit by a mysterious ship and is about to go critical. They steal a shuttle, which later shows up on the relief cruiser. Then two different guys working for a phony intel service try to kill me." "Shovik Orion," she murmured. "What?" "That's the only connection. Shovik Orion. Jerry Underwood was a Shovik Orion employee. And I swear at least one of those goons back there was too. At least, I think he was. There's been tons of staffing changes lately. Lots of new people, lots of old hands getting pink slips, new managers, same old shit." He shrugged, eyeing the schematic map warily. It would take the Urquiza a while to spin up its engines enough to change course, and their shuttle had a good head start. But the massive colonial transporter had more thrust than they did, and most likely a few hidden railguns. What the hell would a corporation want with me? Why would they kill the contractor? You don't think they have anything to do with the alien ship, do you? I mean, you work for Shovik Orion, right? You'd have heard... something. "Well, yes and no. I'm technically with a subcontractor, Snell Staffing Corp." She pointed to a tiny name badge on her chest, which had been obscured by a rip in the fabric. It displayed her name, Sarah Batak, along with a little company logo made up of two intertwined S's surrounded by a larger C. He frowned and brought up the shuttle's computer. Those two IDF guys were looking for something. The contractor, Jerry, claimed it was on board the shuttle. "Go check the hold, will you?" The restraints across her chest and hips fell away as she sprang out of her seat and ducked out of the cockpit. It seemed that, with something to finally do, she had some pent-up energy. An outlet for the nervousness and stress that came from being shot at, and almost exploded. "Nothing," she called back from the tiny cargo hold. "It's empty." "No hidden panels or anything?" She reappeared in the cockpit. "In a T-39? These things are built for space efficiency. No hidden panels, no compartments under the floor, nada." "You're saying this thing ain't built for smugglers. Fine. So whatever was here is gone. Those two IDF assassin guys made off with it." He scanned the computer logs for the shuttle's most recent ports of call. Usually the shuttles on Watchdog were used to transport crew members on and off station, and it relied on the contractors like Shovik Orion to shuttle their own supplies and materials on their own transport ships. But there was always a chance he was wrong. "Looks like the last time this thing left the Bolivar system it went to San Martin," he said, running through the logs. "Makes sense," she said. "It's the center of power here in the Irigoyen sector. Center of commerce, yada yada." "And that's where we're going." He glanced at the schematic map to check on the Urquiza trailing them. Sure enough, it was catching up. He did a scan of the ship, and just as he thought, he saw that an exterior panel had retracted, revealing the unmistakable profile of a railgun. It was still in the process of swiveling towards them. "And there's our cue to leave."
He entered the coordinates for San Martin into the Q-Jump drive computer and confirmed that the cap banks were full. Shuttle's caps are small, so it should take us a few dozen jumps to get out there. Settle in for a good nap. With any luck, I can tap into CENTCOM San Martin when we get there and find out where my pops is.
You really think he can help us? If this is some kind of RDF, Shovik Orion, GPC alien conspiracy thingy, what good can one guy do against that?
Don't know. He pushed the initiator button when the Q-Jump computer indicated it was ready. The view out the front window port adjusted. The green-blue of Bolivar disappeared, along with the approaching Urquiza, replaced by the blackness of deep space. But he knows people, and they know people. He glanced up at her. She didn't look convinced. At this point, what other choice do we have? Chapter 21. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Hutchins Memorial Hospital, room 1400. When she woke up, Proctor was a little surprised to see Admiral Mullins standing over her. Who the hell had let him in her quarters? She'd have to have a stern talk with her Marine detachment, but not before getting something for the splitting headache. It was the searing pain that finally jogged her memory. She was not in her quarters. She was in a hospital in Shovik Orion City.
What the hell happened, Tim?
She murmured, rubbing her forehead. A wrinkled frown bloomed down Mullins's face. Tim. Oh, damn, she thought.
Sorry, Ted. Old habit. Last time I was this injured it was...
Mullins nodded. On the Warrior, with Captain Granger.
Yes.
That blast must have hit her hard. She forced her eyes open and blinked a few times.
Please tell me that wasn't a bomb.
It wasn't a bomb. She looked at him incredulously, then glanced around at the other beds in the intensive care unit, all of them full.
Bull,
she replied. It was a well-timed power surge that triggered a cascade buildup and subsequent failure in the internal cap banks at CENTCOM. We rely on our own power, of course, and not the city's grid, and it looks like in this case it bit us rather firmly in the ass.
You're telling me it was an accident?
He looked down at her gravely, slowly shaking his head. No, I'm not.
Shit.
She repeated the word in her head like a mantra. She was desperately trying to deal with a potentially civilization-ending threat embodied by a mysterious, unthinkably powerful ship, while simultaneously trying to find her lost nephew. She didn't have time to deal with saboteurs and malcontents.
Who the hell was it then?
He sat down in the chair next to her bed. We're still trying to figure that out. Whoever it was, they had long-term access to CENTCOM's power systems, and the expertise to pull this off under the radar, right under our noses. And the expertise to keep us from immediately being able to know who it was. They've covered their tracks like regular pros.
Speculate, then.
Proctor glanced around for a nurse or the attending physician. The pain was subsiding, but her back ached, and she wanted a rundown of her injuries before she duly ignored the sound medical advice and returned to the Independence to save civilization as they knew it. GPC loyalists? Who else could it be?
Are they that brazen already?
Extremists always are. What zealot ever waits until it's prudent to act? They always jump at the chance to make a big splash and catch everyone's attention.
She frowned.
Zealot? What do you mean?
Mullins shrugged and hesitated a moment before continuing.
I have reason to believe that this is not just GPC. There might be a Grangerite element to this.
She rolled her eyes.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
You don't think some of them would be capable?
She shook her head and caught the eye of the doctor at another bed across the room, waving him over.
It's not that they're not capable. It's just that I still can't believe that A, there are Grangerites to begin with, and B, that any of them would leave their temples or churches or underground lairs or whatever the hell they have long enough to plan something like this.
We've had 30 years to get used to the idea of Grangerites, Shelby.
And I had 4 months before that to get used to the idea that Tim Granger was a human being. Not some kind of goddamned prophet. Seriously, if you'd seen him like I saw him, knew him like I knew him, you'd realize the absolute absurdity of it.
He held up his hands defensively.
Hey, no need to convince me of their lunacy. But just because we think they're lunatics for worshipping a bloke we all knew, praying that he comes back to save us all and bring us candy and unicorns, doesn't mean we shouldn't take them seriously. At least their potential threat.
What do you mean? They're ignoramuses. The only dangerous thing about ignoramuses is when they vote for ignoramuses. And last time I checked, there weren't any Grangerite candidates in any elections that matter.
All I'm saying is that, well, I've just heard things. Rumors. That something big is going to happen, or has happened, or is happening. Something that the true zealots are excited about. And then this explosion happens. Right as you show up. Coincidence?
But Ted, who the hell would want to kill me?
The attending physician finally arrived at her bed and looked questioningly at Mullins, as if expecting him to leave. He stood up, but touched Proctor's elbow and leaned down towards her ear.
I'm not sure it was you they were trying to kill.
Her eyes grew wide, and she knew what he was going to say before he said it.
Fiona Liu, your nephew's girlfriend? She's dead.
Chapter 22. Irigoyen Sector, Interstellar Space, Shuttle Fenway. Civic wondered how anyone could stand interstellar travel in a ship with such small Q-jump cap banks. And when he thought about it too much, it gave him a sense of almost overpowering vertigo. You never think about how empty it is out here until you're in it, he murmured, staring out the port at the endless stars. Huh? Batak stirred and opened her eyes. Oops, he thought, not realizing she'd dozed off. Space. Interstellar space is just so empty. Think about it. If that cap bank fails, we're 50,000 years from the nearest star at full thrust. We lose the cap banks and the metaspace transmitter in one go. Then here we are, stuck for the rest of our lives on this shuttle. The rest of our very short lives, she said, closing her eyes again and leaning back. Only so much food the material reprocessors could make out of our shit. He squirmed at the thought. Luckily, the console beeped to distract him. Coming up on Q-jump number 352. 811 to go. Only 810 if we decide to stop off at El Amin. Huh? Furthest planet out in San Martin's solar system. They might have a supply depot there, he added, looking back up through the port to stare at the abyss. It's like walking on a tightrope over a bottomless cliff. One wrong step and pow, you're falling forever, never dying until you have a heart attack or starve. Huh? She repeated. You're starting to worry me, with all your morbid talk. I wonder if this is what it was like for Granger. Huh? He was starting to wonder if that was her only response when she was trying to sleep. You know, as he was falling into that black hole. She grunted. Falling? I thought he was aiming. A smile tugged at his lips. Huh. Right. Swarm never knew what hit him. She shifted in her seat, eyes still closed, trying to get comfortable. Assuming he actually hit them. What do you mean? Well, as of a few weeks ago, he was still technically falling in. Hadn't even crossed the event horizon yet from our perspective. So my question is, how did that actually stop the swarm from sending metaspace signals out of that black hole from their own universe, if Granger hadn't even fallen in yet and blew them to smithereens with the antimatter aboard the Victory? And what was the plan, anyway? There's a lot the higher-ups never told us. I think they're covering up for something, if you ask me. He blew a puff of air in disbelief. What, you're not a Grangerite, are you? Or a conspiracy theorist? A wry smile crossed her lips, even though her eyes stayed closed. Right. Because conspiracies never happen. Just ask Jerry Underwood. He shrugged. Touché. And no, I'm not a Grangerite. Those people are a little mentally disturbed, if you ask me, she murmured. But my brother-in-law is. My sister and he were Methodists, she still is, and the kids.
But he started falling in for the Grangerite stuff a few years ago. But he was always a little whacked.
I just don't understand how they can deify a guy like that. Dad always talked about him, Granger. Said he was just this regular dude. A bloke, as Mom called him. And now these freaks are turning him into a god? Seriously? Welcome to the 27th century, people.
Catholics do it all the time.
Huh? Now it was his turn for the huhs.
You know, saints and all that.
Oh. Right. Still, at least they... He trailed off, wondering what point he was about to make.
At least they what?
You know, at least they've got almost 3,000 years of precedent and history behind them. They've been making people saints for millennia, and Jesus is, like, ancient history. There's some historical heft there. The same with Muhammad and Buddha and whatever religion you want. But Granger? We've got video of him. People are still alive that knew him. How do you make a god out of that? Especially now, in the present? Modern society, modern culture and all that?
I'm sure people living around Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha thought the same thing.
Yeah? And what happened to them? She shrugged.
They either all converted or were killed, I guess.
Oh, that's a wonderful thought. Her eyes still closed, she flashed a devious smile.
So, would you rather lose Q-jump engines in interstellar space in a shuttle, or convert to Grangerism?
He chuckled. Depends. Can I bring a deck of cards on the shuttle? Or at least a multi-level marketing sales presentation pamphlet? Then I choose the shuttle. The console beeped again. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for jump number 353, he announced. She grunted.
I'm trying to sleep here.
Fine, I'll shut up. She smiled and snuggled down further into her seat. But before I do, she frowned. Help me think through this. What could be so important that someone would kill for it right in the middle of a battle when the station is about to explode? She shrugged.
Chocolate?
I'm serious here.
So am I. Are you going to let me sleep or not?
He sighed. Just thought it might be important to think about, seeing how someone's trying to, kill us because we already know too much about it.
Not much we can do about it now, can we? In case you hadn't noticed, we're kinda in interstellar space.
He ignored her. It was crucial that they figure this out, and not only to save their own necks, it just felt wrong. There was far more riding on this than just a few hired goons shooting at them. Something big was happening, or was about to happen. It was either a weapon, or evidence about something. Evidence of some conspiracy or wrongdoing or whatever. The guy, Underwood, kept on calling it it. So it's a singular item, not a collection of things. Unless it meant like a crate with lots of stuff in it. Or maybe...
You're not even making any sense, she mumbled.
I'm wondering if it's connected to sangre. She frowned.
I'm not good with Spanish. Blood?
Sangre de Cristo.
Oh. You think it was another nuke? Aren't those, conspicuous?
He nodded. Well, yeah. Especially since they're banned. He bolted upright, then stood. She finally opened her eyes.
What? What is it?
If it was a nuke, we can tell. He dashed out of the cockpit and she rolled out of her seat to follow him. As if reading his mind, she grabbed the engine diagnostic toolkit and pulled out the general-purpose scanner.
What band?
She asked, fiddling with the handheld device. Gamma band. That's the one that will detect any leftover radioactive signature. She nodded, frustratedly.
Sorry, I should know that.
You're good. He worried about her. It was clear she was still in a little shock from the previous day's traumatic events, in spite of her show of bravado and humor. She went into the cargo hold and waved the detector back and forth across the floor, over the walls, up to the ceiling. He waited, patiently. Damn it, hurry the hell up.
Okay, looks like...
She paused. And? He asked.
Nothing. No leftover radioactive signature.
He sighed. Well, it was worth a shot. He started heading back to the cockpit. She wasn't moving.
Wait, I'm reading something now.
He stopped in the doorway. What is it? Her eyes went wide.
I've no idea.
Chapter 23. Irigoyen Sector, Bolivar System, Bolivar. Bridge, ISS Independence. The doctor had recommended bed rest and observation for a day in the hospital, followed by a week of recuperating at home, along with pain meds and reconstructive enzyme therapy for the torn ligament in her right leg, and some frightfully large orange pill as a precaution against hemorrhaging because of her concussion. Proctor had smiled, thanked her, and told her to go to hell when the doctor protested her getting out of bed and boarding her shuttle back up to the Independence.
Admiral on the bridge,
called out one of the Marines at the entrance as she hobbled through. Damn, was she hobbling? Commander Yarbrough looked up suddenly from the XO station.
Admiral? Are you feeling well enough to continue with the mission? Am I dead?
Yarbrough's eyes narrowed slightly. His reply was slightly hesitant.
No? Then we're continuing the mission. Prepare for T-jump. Any new sign of the mystery ship?
He shook his head, then glanced at Tactical, and Lieutenant Whitehorse flashed a quick thumbs down.
No, Admiral, no sign of it. All systems in this sector are on the lookout and have express instructions to report to us by metaspace signal if anything changes.
He hesitated again.
Ma'am? Where exactly are we T-jumping to, if we have no contact with the alien vessel?
Proctor, trying not to limp too much, walked to her chair and eased herself into it.
Damn it. 70-year-old bodies and torn ligaments don't mix very well. San Martin. What's on San Martin?
She snapped her head towards him with an impatient glare.
Our destination.
Yarbrough nodded nervously.
I'm sorry, Admiral, I didn't mean to sound impudent, if that's how I came across. It's just... Fleet Admiral Oppenheimer has been insistently... badgering would be the wrong word, but he's been following our progress very closely. Wait, Oppenheimer's been in touch with you?
Yarbrough looked uncomfortable.
Yes, ma'am. Metaspace messages.
Interesting. Oppenheimer was keeping tabs on her. Through her own XO, no less.
Very well. Keep me apprised of what he says. And if CENTCOM Omaha has any new info for us on the extrapolated origins of this thing... Oh.
She turned to face him fully.
And see what you can find out on the GPC. Ma'am? You know, what Oppenheimer and his people are doing about it. What the political climate at CENTCOM is. If their reach has extended up into the chain of command, I want to know about it. See what Oppenheimer's opinion of them is. His real opinion. He and I are not exactly conversation buddies. Yes, ma'am.
Yarbrough turned back to his station, but paused as if he had more to say.
Spit it out, Commander.
The man actually looked sheepish.
You don't suppose Oppenheimer is sympathetic to the GPC, do you?
Proctor glanced sidelong at the rest of the bridge crew out of the corner of her eye. She could see Lieutenant Whitehorse sit up a hair straighter. Ensign Risa cocked her head slightly. Proctor knew that gossip, especially the juicy political kind, was the lifeblood of a crew, even in wartime. Hell, especially in wartime, people just seemed to need something to distract them from the awful realities of life and death.
No, I don't,
she replied quickly, maybe too quickly.
Ready room, now.
She pointed to the door off to the side and grunted as she pushed herself to a standing position. Damn leg. She resented it already. She hobbled into the ready room, making no effort to hide the limp this time, all pretense of being the picture of health for her crew forgotten. The door slid shut behind them. She turned to face the commander, her eyes flared open wide.
Commander Yarbrough, on this ship, on my bridge, we do not openly speculate about the political leanings of our commanding officers. Period. Is that clear?
Yarbrough cowered. Coward.
Sorry, Admiral, I'm... sorry. I didn't think that combat would affect me as much as... well, as much as it did.
Proctor's face softened a bit. She was being too hard on him. On all of them. None of them, save Ballsy, had actually been in combat before. Though neither had she when the swarm attacked out of the blue 30 years ago. Swarm behavior and biology had been her doctoral thesis, and even she had been taken by surprise. She had been sure the swarm was on a 150-year activity cycle, and that, 75 years after their first attack, humanity was safe for another 75. Humanity should have enjoyed 75 more years of security, time to build before the next attack. As it turns out, the sense of safety was false, and Proctor swore to never again be lulled away into a feeling of false security. But it was one thing to live through all that, and another to be ready for it all to happen again. These people, her crew, never had that. They only had their history books, stories of bravery, cultural legends of heroism, loss, and sacrifice. They'd all lost relatives in the war, but it was already distant enough to be out of living memory for anyone under 50.
It's okay, Commander. I was the same way in your position 30 years ago.
He did a double take.
You were?
No, I wasn't. I was a frickin' machine.
Yes. Believe me, you're doing fine.
His face told her he still didn't believe her. So she waved him over to the desk and sat down, pointing to the other chair. She reached over to the teapot that she'd asked Ensign Flay to have ready and hot at all times, and poured them both a cup.
I was Captain Granger's new XO, the hero of Earth,
interjected Yarbrough, accepting the cup of tea.
The hero of Earth, yes. Oh, you'd be surprised that the hero of Earth had his moments. He doubted, agonized over what to do. It was hit or miss there for a while. Mostly miss. But anyway, I was his new XO, and my job, given to me by your grandmother, by the way, was to decommission the Constitution, with Granger still on it. Can you imagine?
She didn't, said Yarbrough, with an amused air, his brow furrowed in disbelief.
She did. But I was up and coming, let me tell you. I was going to have my own command if it killed me, and I saw that as my opportunity to prove myself to old Admiral Yarbrough. I mean, if she could trust me with such a bold assignment, then she could sure as hell trust me with my own little cruiser. And so I went aboard the Constitution, and I was a ball-buster, taking names, blazing a trail that would have gotten me kicked off of any other ship under any other captain.
The hero of Earth was pretty magnanimous then.
She snorted. Magnanimous? Tim? He was as crotchety as they come. I'd only been aboard a few days and he was thinking about airlocking me.
Why didn't he?
Yarbrough leaned in closer, sipping his tea. The swarm saved me, ironically enough. Once it became clear what we were up against, my job, my only job, was to enable Tim to win. He was my captain, and, well, he wasn't the greatest, most inspirational leader around. He had grit. And he had what all of us need in a situation like that. He was a survivor. He wasn't going to go quietly. He was going to do anything to stop the swarm and win. I recognized that in him instantly, and so I made it my job to make his job doable. I ran the ship. I organized the repair crews, the ordnance and reload teams, the fighter jocks, the ops teams, the science team, well, you name it. I slept about 2 hours a night for those 4 months, and aged 20 years in the process. And in the end, we did it. Tim did it. We won.
Not without a huge cost, though, he added. Granger piloted the Victory into the black hole the swarm was coming through to shut it down.
He did, and saved us all in the process.
Some say he's still there, that he'll come back someday.
Yarbrough finished his tea and set the cup down. Grangerites, yes. They need their messiah, whether it's Jesus or Buddha, or in this case a man who finished his day by collapsing onto his couch, farting up a storm, and scratching off his bunions with his thumbnail.
Is it even possible? Can he come back? Technically, he hasn't even crossed the event horizon yet.
Actually, he has, as of a month ago. She took a sip of tea. The light coming off of the Victory finally red-shifted down into the radio waves, and once the wavelength of those waves stretches out to be greater than the width of the event horizon, then he's truly crossed it from our perspective. At least, that's what the theoretical physicists say. No, he can't come back. He's gone. Forever. She finished her own tea and leaned forward again, touching Yarbrough's forearm amiably. Commander, I need you. The point of all that is to say, I need you. Granger was nothing without me, and without you I likewise can be nothing. As Captain and XO, we depend on each other, absolutely and irrevocably. Like no other relationship, especially in wartime. We live for this moment, right here. The moment when our entire civilization depends on us. Yarbrough nodded, with what Proctor interpreted as the man's best show of confidence. Yes, ma'am. I'll do the best I can. Can I trust you? Without blinking, he nodded. Yes. Good. Because this threat is like nothing I've ever seen. 25 years ago, when the order came down from President Singh to go and annihilate the last trace of the swarm, or rather the liquid beings that the swarm had usurped for use in our galaxy as the vehicle of their influence in our plane of existence, I was ambivalent. Torn, really. I was being asked to commit genocide, and regrettably I did not have an XO at the time that I could trust, that I could depend on to help me make the right decision. Yarbrough shifted in his seat uncomfortably. I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. So your mission failed? Failed? Of course not, it was a rousing success. I utterly destroyed the last few remaining swarm carriers, and raised the surfaces of the planet the liquid beings called their home. And my XO was there, encouraging me to go through with it just as CENTCOM wanted him to. Then what was wrong with him? What was wrong with him is that ever since then, I have the sneaking suspicion that I made the wrong choice. I committed genocide against a race that was as much a tool of the swarm as the Russian Confederation had become. Would it have been right to utterly destroy the Russian Confederation? Every last man, woman, child? Of course not. But that's what I did to the liquid swarm. And I should have been able to depend on my XO to see the situation clearly and urge me to make the right choice. He didn't. And I've lived with that decision every day since. I have to look myself in the mirror at night with that knowledge. She looked up at him. I pray you never have to do that. Yarbrough leaned back in his chair, seemingly at a loss for words. And years later, that XO succeeded me as the Fleet Admiral of IDF. Admiral Oppenheimer knows my views on this subject, and I've told him that, given the choice, I will not destroy our enemy if I can help it. I will stop them, but I won't destroy them. At least not without knowing their true nature. If it turns out that they are evil personified, then fine, bam, I'll rain fiery death on them relentlessly. But with the exception of the swarm, I've never encountered any being of unmitigated evil like that. And I want to know that when the moment comes, when the time of decision is at hand, that you'll have my back and be my conscience. She reached out again and gripped his forearm. I need to know you'll help me make the right decision this time. Yarbrough shook his head, maybe a little too quickly. Oh well, he'd learn, just like she did. I will, Admiral. I'll do my best, you can count on me. Though, Admiral? Yes. If we're going to trust one another completely like you've so eloquently suggested, I'd really like to know why we're going to San Martin.